Tonight, we're diving into the whole of it, the entire saga of Dune, all 6 of Frank Herbert's books gathered into one long, slow telling, from a boy arriving on a desert world to the last refuge at the edge of a scattered humanity, tens of thousands of years later. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing to solve here, and nothing to fear. Only a slow, even voice carrying you across the centuries, chapter by chapter, toward sleep. If these long, quiet stories are the ones that finally ease you under, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming, night after night, and that is the only small thing I will ask of you. Before we begin, over the next 20 chapters we will move, without haste, through the fall of a great house, the rise of a Messiah, the long golden path of a God who became a worm, the scattering of humankind across the dark, and the sisterhood that endured through all of it. You do not need to hold on to any of it. Let it move through you like wind over an endless dune, slow and patient, and let it carry you, softly, down toward rest. Far across the currents of the known universe, further than the eye could trace even on the clearest night, there turned a small and burning world called Arrakis, and upon its face there was no ocean, no lake, no slow green river winding toward the sea. For this was a planet given over entirely to sand, to stone, to a dry wind that never rested, and to a light that fell all day long like a weight upon the shoulders of anyone who dared to walk beneath it. The people of the wider Imperium called it Dune, a name spoken sometimes with fear and sometimes with a strange and reverent longing, because this single desert world, poor in water beyond almost any imagining, was rich beyond all others in the one substance that made the vast civilization of humankind possible at all. The substance called the spice, called mlash, a fine reddish dust drawn up from the deep sand, where it ripened in secret beneath the moving dunes. Let the mind settle now into the slow rhythm of this telling, for the story that follows spans thousands of years, and it asks only that you drift along with it as one drifts along a river at night, unhurried, carried gently from one age into the next. Picture first the great sweep of the Imperium as it stood in those early years, a civilization spread across countless worlds and bound together by 3 powers that balanced one another with the patience of old rivals who had long since learned the cost of open war. There was the Padishah Emperor himself, Shaddam IV, who sat upon the golden lion throne on the planet Kaitain, ruling over the landsrod of great houses from a palace so vast that its gardens alone could have swallowed whole cities, and around him moved the great families of the nobility, houses old and proud, each holding its own fiefs and its own private armies, each bound by ancient law to the emperor, and yet each watching him and watching one another, with the wary patience of chess players who had studied the board for centuries. And there was the Spacing Guild, strange and secretive, whose navigators had changed themselves so profoundly through long exposure to the spice that they were said to be no longer quite human in the way that others were human, folded now into their tanks of orange gas, their bodies transformed. Their minds opened just enough to peer through the folds of space and to guide the great highliners safely from star to star. Without the spice, the guild navigators could not see the safe path through the void, and without the guild, no army, no noble house, no merchant fleet could travel between the worlds at all, and so the guild held a quiet, absolute power over every journey ever made, and it demanded its price in spice before it would move so much as a single ship. And there was the Bene Gesserit, a sisterhood of women trained for uncounted generations in disciplines of the body and the mind, so exacting that outsiders often mistook their calm control for something like sorcery, though it was in truth only patience carried further than most humans ever thought to carry it. The Bene Gesserit sisters could read the smallest tremor in a voice, could master pain and fear within their own flesh, could bend other minds with a carefully placed word. And for 15,000 years and more, they had followed a breeding program of extraordinary length and secrecy, weaving bloodlines across the great houses of the Imperium in pursuit of a single goal: the emergence of a being they called the Kwisatz Haderach, one who could look where no woman of the sisterhood had ever been able to look, into places of the past and the future that had always before remained hidden and folded away from human sight. Beneath all of these, quietly binding them together in matters of commerce, ran the great trading combine known as CHOAM, the Combine Honnet Ober Advancer Mercantiles, through which the noble houses and the emperor himself held shares and drew their fortunes, and the largest single source of that fortune, larger than any other, was the melange itself, harvested at terrible risk from the deep desert of Arrakis and carried outward to every corner of human space. The spice extended life, so that a person who used it faithfully might live 150 years or more with a clarity of body and mind unknown to those who never touched it. The spice opened awareness in gentle, subtle ways, so that a person who breathed its dust across long years might come to sense things just beyond the ordinary reach of the five senses, small warnings of danger, faint intimations of things soon to happen. The spice made the guild's navigation possible at all. And for all of these reasons, immeasurable wealth flowed toward whoever held Arrakis, and immeasurable danger gathered around whoever wished to take it away from them. Now let your thoughts sink further, past the noble houses and their glittering courts, down into the deep basins and the towering dunes of Arrakis itself, where a hidden people had made their home for many generations. The desert dwellers called themselves the Fremen, and to the offworlders who administered the planet's few cities and mining operations, the Fremen were little more than a rumor, a scattered handful of desert vagabonds not worth serious attention. And this was exactly the impression the Fremen wished to leave, for in truth their numbers ran into the millions, hidden away in sietch communities carved deep into the rock, sealed behind wind traps and dew collectors that captured every possible drop of moisture from the thin desert air. The Fremen had learned across centuries of hardship to treat water as the most precious thing in existence, more precious even than the spice that lay scattered so richly beneath their feet, and they had learned, too, to live alongside the colossal sandworms that ruled the deep desert, immense creatures hundreds of meters in length, called Shai-Hulud in the old Fremen tongue, whose passage through the dunes could swallow a harvesting machine whole in an instant, and who were, though few offworlders understood this, bound up in the very cycle that produced the spice itself. It was into this delicately balanced world, this world of glittering courts and hidden desert tribes, of guild navigators and patient sisterhoods, that a single noble house was about to be drawn, called away from its ancestral home on the gentle ocean world of Caladan, and sent instead to Arrakis under imperial decree. And though the house that received this summons believed at first that a great honor had been granted to them, there were those in the shadows, watching quietly, who understood that a very different design was already in motion, one that had been prepared with great care over many years, waiting only for the right house, the right duke, and the right moment to be sprung. Up next, in Chapter 2, The Fall of House Atreides, we'll follow Duke Leto Atreides and his household as they leave the calm shores of Caladan behind and travel to Arrakis, where the honor they have been given will reveal itself, slowly and irreversibly, as the opening move of a trap 15 years in the making. On the ocean world of Caladan, where the air was soft and heavy with salt and rain fell in long gentle curtains across green hills, Duke Leto Atreides had ruled for many years with a fairness that his people loved him for. And it was here, in the quiet halls of Castle Caladan, that word arrived from the Golden Lion throne itself, informing the Duke that House Atreides was to take possession of Arrakis, relieving House Harkonnen of a fief they had held and profited from for 80 years. To many within the household, this seemed at first a stroke of fortune almost too great to believe, for whoever controlled Arrakis controlled the flow of the spice. And the spice was the very foundation upon which the wealth of the Imperium rested. But Duke Leto himself, a man of long experience in the currents of Landsraad politics, understood with a heavy and quiet certainty that no gift given by an emperor to a duke he had reason to fear could ever be entirely what it seemed, and he suspected, correctly, that Arrakis was not a reward at all, but the opening jaw of a very old and very patient trap. He suspected, too, that the emperor himself feared the rising reputation of House Atreides, feared especially the loyalty that Leto commanded among his own soldiers. A loyalty built not on fear, but on the genuine love a people feel for a just ruler, and feared as well the quiet friendships Leto maintained with other great houses who might one day rally behind him against the throne. And so the move to Arrakis, though dressed in the language of honor and imperial favor, was in truth a maneuver to draw House Atreides away from the safety of its home world and out into the open desert, where old enemies, chief among them the cruel and calculating Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, could be permitted, quietly, almost invisibly, to finish what the Emperor himself could not be seen to begin. Despite knowing this, Duke Leto could not refuse the Emperor's command, for such a refusal would have meant open war against the throne itself, a war House Atreides could not hope to win alone. And so the household began its long preparation to leave Caladan behind. Lady Jessica, the Duke's own Bene Gesserit concubine, moved quietly through these final days with a stillness that concealed a great deal of private worry, for she loved Leto deeply, though the sisterhood had trained her for another purpose entirely, and she watched over their son Paul with a mother's tenderness laid over a teacher's careful discipline. For Paul had been raised since early childhood in disciplines of mind and body that no ordinary boy of 15 years would ever have been given. Taught the Bene Gesserit ways of observation and self-mastery that his mother had passed to him against the strict rules of her own order, and trained as well by Gurney Halleck and by the swordmaster Duncan Idaho in the arts of combat that a duke's heir would need to survive in a dangerous universe. The journey to Arrakis was long, carried across the folded pathways of space by a guild highliner, and when at last the household arrived upon the desert world, they found a landscape unlike anything Caladan had prepared them for. A vast dry emptiness broken only by the low huddled buildings of the city of Arrakeen, where the light fell hard and white from a sky that held no comforting clouds, and where the wind itself seemed to carry a faint dry whisper of warning. Duke Leto set about his work with the calm determination of a man who understood his danger, and yet refused to be governed by fear, seeking alliances with the planet's native Fremen, whose fighting skill and desert knowledge he recognized as a resource far more valuable than the Harkonnens had ever troubled themselves to notice, and hoping that in time these hardy desert people might become the foundation of a new strength for his house. But the trap that had been so long prepared was already closing around him, for among the Duke's own most trusted men there walked a traitor, planted with terrible patience many years before. Dr. Wellington Yua, the Suk physician, who had served the household with every appearance of unshakable loyalty, carried within him a secret anguish that the Harkonnens had learned to exploit with a cruelty as calculated as it was complete. For his beloved wife Wana had been taken captive by the Baron's agents, and Yua had been told, and desperately wished to believe, that his cooperation might yet secure her freedom, though in his heart he suspected, correctly, that she was already lost to him, and that his own betrayal would only be repaid with betrayal in turn. On the night the Harkonnen and Imperial Sardaukar forces fell upon Arrakeen, moving in overwhelming numbers against a garrison Yua had already crippled from within by disabling the house shields, Duke Leto stood at the heart of a collapse he had feared without ever being able entirely to prevent it. Yue drugged the Duke into helplessness and delivered him directly into the hands of the Baron, and yet even in this darkest moment, Yue could not bring himself to betray everything, for he placed within Leto's own mouth a false tooth capsule holding a deadly poison gas, and he whispered to the captive Duke, when the Baron at last stood near enough, that this single breath might yet avenge him. When Leto's moment came, weakened and afraid though he was, he bit down upon that hidden tooth with the last of his strength, releasing the poison gas into the room. And though the Baron himself narrowly escaped its reach through the quick intervention of his own physician, Duke Leto Atreides died there in the ruin of his own captured city, having given everything he had left to give in one final act of defiance against the men who had destroyed his house. Elsewhere in the chaos of that night, Lady Jessica and young Paul were spared the same fate only because the Baron, guided by counsel Jessica herself, had once trained him to fear, had ordered that they be taken alive and abandoned deep in the desert rather than killed outright within the city. A decision made in part so that no direct blame for their deaths could ever be traced back to House Harkonnen, and in part because of an old superstition among the Fremen concerning the fulfillment of a long-awaited prophecy. And so, in the black hours after the fall of Arrakeen, an ornithopter carried Jessica and Paul away from the wreckage of everything they had known, out over the endless dunes, away from the guards who had been ordered to leave them for dead among the sand, and toward a fate that no one within the fallen household could yet have imagined. Up next in Chapter 3, Into the Deep Desert, we'll follow Paul and his mother as they flee across the open sand in search of any refuge at all, and we'll watch as the boy who was once merely the Duke's heir begins to change, quietly and irrevocably, into someone the desert itself seems to be waiting for. The desert at night, for those who have never crossed it, is a difficult thing to imagine. For by day Arrakis offers a burning and merciless light, but once the sun falls away behind the dunes, the sand grows cool, and the sky opens overhead into a vast dark quiet, scattered with more stars than a sky over any ocean world could ever show. And it was into this cool and star-scattered darkness that Paul and his mother Jessica escaped, following the very edge of their fallen house's ruin. Carried at first by a stolen ornithopter piloted with a skill Paul had only ever practiced before in careful lessons, and never before under the pressure of true and desperate need. They flew low across the shifting dunes, guided as much by instinct as by any clear plan, seeking distance from the Harkonnen and Sardaukar forces who had descended upon Arrakeen. And as the hours passed, the desert itself seemed to close protectively around them, folding them into its emptiness the way deep water closes over something sinking slowly beneath the surface. A great storm rose against them before they could find safety, one of the vast Coriolis storms that gather across the open basins of Arrakis, with a violence that can strip flesh from bone and metal from its frame, and it was only through Paul's own quick judgment, guided by an awareness that seemed to reach a little further than ordinary caution should have allowed, that they were able to ride the storm's edge rather than be consumed within its heart, setting their small craft down at last upon a rocky outcropping where the wind could not fully reach them. A place the Fremen called the False Wall, a line of rock rising from the sand like the spine of some ancient buried creature. It was here, in the days and nights that followed, exposed continually to the fine dust of the spice that lay everywhere across this land, in the very air they breathed and the sand beneath their feet, that something within Paul began to shift and open in a way his earlier training, careful as it had been, could never quite have prepared him for. He had already been touched, back on Caledon and in the earliest days of his life, by strange half-glimpses of things not yet arrived, small premonitions that came to him sometimes in dreams and sometimes in the quiet space just before sleep. But here on Arrakis, breathing spice-laden air continuously, exposed to a concentration of melange far beyond anything he had known before, those glimpses widened and deepened until Paul found himself looking, however briefly and however uncertainly, along pathways of time that stretched both backward through a long inherited past and forward into futures, still only half decided. He began to see, in flashes that came upon him unbidden, glimpses of a terrible jihad spreading outward from this very desert across the stars, carried in his own name whether he willed it or not, and he began to understand, with a dread his mother could sense but not entirely share, that the ordinary path of his life as a duke's son had ended forever in the fall of Arrakeen, and that something far larger and far more dangerous now lay open before him, a path he had not chosen, and yet could not simply refuse. Jessica watched her son during these days with a mixture of pride and quiet fear, for she recognized in him abilities that reached beyond even what the Bene Gesserit sisterhood had ever managed to cultivate in any single person, and she began to suspect, with a mother's mixture of hope and dread, that Paul might be the very Kwisatz Haderach the sisterhood had labored across 15,000 years of careful breeding to produce. Arriving one generation before the sisterhood itself had planned, born from a bloodline Jessica herself had bent slightly from its intended course, out of her own private love for Leto, choosing to bear a son rather than the daughter she had been instructed to bear. Their food and water dwindled as they crossed the open basin beyond the false wall. And it was there, moving carefully now, to avoid the great worm sign that rippled sometimes beneath the surface of the sand nearby, that they came at last upon a band of the desert's true inhabitants, a group of Fremen, led by a man named Stilgar, Naib of the Sietch Tabr, whose people had been watching the strangers' slow progress across the dunes for some time before revealing themselves. The Fremen approached with weapons drawn and faces wrapped against the dry air, wary of off-worlders in a way that centuries of imperial neglect and Harkonnen cruelty had taught them to be. And for a long moment, it seemed entirely possible that Paul and Jessica's flight across the desert might end here, quietly, among strangers who owed them nothing at all. But Jessica, drawing upon the deep Bene Gesserit training that had shaped every year of her adult life, recognized among these desert warriors certain signs, certain words and gestures that told her the Missionaria Protectiva, the sisterhood's own ancient program of seeded legend, had done its careful work upon this planet many generations before her arrival, planting among the Fremen old prophecies of an off-world woman and a chosen son who would one day come to lead them toward freedom. She began, with the calm and deliberate skill of a woman who had trained her entire life for exactly this kind of encounter, to speak and to move in ways that echoed those planted prophecies. Invoking through carefully chosen phrases and through her own evident mastery of the voice, that subtle Bene Gesserit art of commanding tone, the deep suspicion that these were no ordinary off-world refugees at all. Stilgar, watching this exchange with the careful eyes of a leader responsible for the survival of his entire community, found himself torn between the plain practical danger of taking in two strangers who might bring Harkonnen attention down upon his sietch, and the older, deeper pull of prophecy that Jessica's words and bearing seemed to answer so precisely. In the end, weighing Paul's own evident abilities, the boy having already shown a swiftness and awareness that impressed even these hardened desert fighters, and weighing too his own uncertain sense that something significant was unfolding before him, Stilgar made the decision to bring the two strangers back with his band toward the safety of Sietch Tabr, rather than leave them to the mercy of the open desert, or worse, to the mercy of the Harkonnen patrols that still hunted for any survivors of House Atreides. And so, as the small band of Fremen turned back toward the deep sand paths that only they truly knew, carrying with them the last Duke's widow and the last Duke's son, the desert itself seemed to close quietly around this new arrangement, sealing away, at least for now, any trace of the two fugitives from the eyes of the Harkonnen forces still searching the dunes above. Up next in Chapter 4, The Fremen and the Prophecy, will descend with Paul and Jessica into the hidden world of Sietch Tabr, where an entire culture built around the discipline of water will slowly reveal itself, and where the old prophecies Jessica has already begun to use will start to settle, quietly and irreversibly, around her son. Deep beneath the rock of the false wall, reached through narrow passages that no off-worlder could have found without a guide, lay Sietch Tabr, one of many hidden communities where the Fremen had built their lives across many generations, sealed behind heavy doors that kept the precious moisture of human breath and human bodies from escaping uselessly into the dry desert air outside. When Paul and Jessica were led at last through these passages and into the great inner caverns of the Sietch, they found themselves looking upon a way of life shaped entirely, in every smallest detail, by the ever-present scarcity of water. A discipline so complete and so deeply woven into every custom that an outsider needed a long while simply to begin to understand its quiet logic. Here, water was measured and hoarded with a devotion that off-worlders raised among rivers and rain could hardly imagine, and every drop of moisture, whether sweat gathered by the fine mesh lining of a stillsuit or condensation drawn from the warm breath of sleeping bodies through carefully engineered wind traps set into the rock above, was reclaimed and returned to the communal water hoard that sustained the entire Sietch through the driest months. The Fremen wore their stillsuits at all times when moving through the open desert, garments that Paul quickly learned to recognize as small marvels of quiet engineering, recycling the body's own moisture continuously so that a person properly sealed within one might survive for days in the open sand on no more water than could be held in a single small flask. And when at last a Fremen died, whether from age or violence, even that person's own body water was reclaimed by the tribe, returned with solemn ceremony to the deep cisterns hidden beneath the Sietch. For the Fremen believed, with good and practical reason, that the water of the dead belonged rightfully to the whole tribe, and to the future the tribe was slowly, patiently building. That future, spoken of quietly among the more devout of the Fremen, concerned a great dream held across many generations, The dream that one day their planet's own harsh climate might be transformed, gradually and painstakingly across centuries of careful ecological labor, into something greener and gentler, capable of holding open water upon its surface once more. This dream had been kept alive by planetologists such as Liet Kynes, whose father had first begun to teach the Fremen how their own careful management of moisture, sietch by sietch, dune by dune, might one day reshape their entire world, and it gave to Fremen life a long patience that stretched far beyond any single lifetime. A willingness to labor now for a reward that only their grandchildren's grandchildren might ever see. Paul learned, too, in these early days within the sietch, of the great sandworms the Fremen called Shai Hulud, creatures whose enormous bodies moved beneath the dunes with a power that could swallow entire harvesting machines whole, and whose passage through the open desert was so fundamental to the Fremen's own spiritual life that the worm had become for them something both feared and revered. A maker, they called it, in whose presence lesser men learned humility. He watched, with a wonder he could not entirely hide, how the more skilled among the Fremen were able to summon and to ride these vast creatures across the open sand, using hooked maker hooks that forced open the worm's own segmented plates, turning the beast's need to keep its sensitive inner flesh away from the abrasive sand into a means of guiding its enormous strength across great distances. And he came slowly to understand, though the full truth would only unfold for him gradually, that these worms and the spice itself were bound together in a cycle far older and stranger than most offworlders had ever guessed. The little maker forms and the deep worms and the spice sand, all part of a single long and patient process that the Fremen alone, among all the peoples of the Imperium, truly understood. Alongside all of this practical knowledge, Paul and Jessica came gradually to recognize just how thoroughly the Bene Gesserit's own ancient program, the Missionaria Protectiva, had already prepared the ground for their arrival. Generations before, agents of the sisterhood had traveled quietly among primitive and isolated peoples across many worlds, planting among them protective legends, useful superstitions designed to be called upon later should any Bene Gesserit sister ever find herself stranded and in need of protection among a people otherwise unfamiliar with the sisterhood's ways. Among the Fremen, this seeded legend had taken the particular shape of a prophecy concerning the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, a chosen one who would come to them from beyond their own planet, accompanied by a Bene Gesserit mother, and who would lead the Fremen at last toward the paradise their long patient labor had been building toward for so many generations. Jessica, recognizing this legend for what it was almost from her first hours among Stilgar's people, made the deliberate choice to lean into it rather than to resist it, understanding with the sharp practical wisdom of her training that survival for herself and for her son depended entirely now upon the protection and the goodwill of these desert people, and that the quickest path to such protection lay through the very prophecy the sisterhood itself had planted here so long before. She spoke and moved among the Fremen in ways carefully calculated to echo the old prophecy, and slowly, cautiously, the sietch began to whisper among itself that perhaps, after everything, the long-awaited ones had finally come. Paul, watching all of this unfold around him, felt within himself a rising and uneasy awareness that his mother's careful manipulation of Fremen belief, however necessary it might be for their immediate survival, was also feeding something far larger and more dangerous. A momentum building beneath him that he could sense reaching forward through gathering visions into a future stained by war, carried in his own name across the stars, a jihad he had glimpsed already in the depths of the desert and had no simple way to prevent. And yet, standing now before Stilgar and the assembled people of Sietch Tabr, tested in a formal combat against a young Fremen named Jameis, who challenged him according to the tribe's own ancient law. Paul found that he had already been carried too far along this path to turn back, and when the contest ended with Jameis dead by Paul's own hand, the Fremen accepted him fully into their community, giving him the tribal name Usul for his private use among them, and the use name Muad'Dib after the small desert mouse whose survival wisdom the Fremen admired, a name that would soon travel far beyond the walls of any single Sietch. Up next in Chapter 5, The Rise of Muad'Dib, we'll watch as Paul, now truly one of the Fremen, begins to gather around himself both the fierce loyalty of the desert warriors and the terrible weight of the prophecy his mother helped set in motion, moving step by careful step toward a destiny that will soon reach far beyond the sands of Arrakis, in the deep folds of the desert, where the Sietch of Tabr and then the Sietch called Sietch Tabr's kin communities breathed in the dark like sleeping animals. The boy who had been Paul Atreides began, very slowly and very quietly, to become someone else. The Fremen did not rush this change, for they understood, in the patient way of a people who had waited for a prophecy across 10,000 generations, that names are things that must be earned in the manner that water is earned, drop by drop, through trial and through time. And so it was that Paul was given the chance to choose a name of his own, a use name for daylight and for the songs of children, and he thought of the small mouse of the desert, the kangaroo mouse that could be found in the lee of the rocks, quick and quiet and able to live on almost nothing, and he chose the name Muad'Dib, for this mouse was cunning, and it created its own water, and it was drawn on the second moon of Arrakis by the shadows that men could see if they looked up long enough into the dark. He said this name to Stilgar and to the others gathered in the stone stillness of the cavern, and the Fremen received it with a solemn murmuring, for Muad'Dib was a name they knew from their oldest teachings, a name folded into the legends brought long ago from other worlds, and to hear it spoken now by this pale youth from the water-heavy lands beyond the desert was a thing that settled into their chests like a held breath finally released. But there was also a secret name, a private name for the Sietch alone, and this one Paul gave himself in the quiet hours, calling himself Usul, which meant the base of the pillar, the strength upon which a wall may safely lean. The Fremen approved of this too, for it seemed a fitting thing for a young man who carried within him, though none but his mother yet fully guessed it, the weight of futures not yet born. And in the giving of these two names, the outward one bright as moonlight over dunes, and the inward one buried like a well beneath stone, something in Paul settled as well, for a person with two names is a person who has begun to belong to two worlds at once, and it is a slow and gentle thing to feel oneself take root in ground that was, not so very long before, entirely foreign. It was in this same stretch of days, warm and unhurried as the shifting of sand under a windless sky, that Paul first came to know Chani in the manner that mattered most, not merely as a guide who had led him and his mother out of the deep desert, but as someone whose quiet competence and whose laughter, soft and low, made the endless labor of Sietch life into something that could, on occasion, feel almost like rest. She taught him the small things that the manuals of his old life had never covered: how to walk without walking, how to still a beating heart when death moved nearby, how to hear the difference between the wind that meant nothing and the wind that meant a worm was coming. And in the teaching, something passed between them that was older than any of the great designs moving through that time. The simple and unremarkable fact of two young people finding comfort in each other beneath the same stone roof, beneath the same far ceiling of stars that showed themselves each night through the fissures in the rock. Yet even in this new home, tradition demanded its due, and there came the trial that every Fremen youth who wished to walk fully among them must eventually face, though few outsiders were ever permitted to face it at all. Jameis, who had already once challenged Paul in the earliest days after the escape from Harkonnen patrols, and lost that challenge only because Paul had already, without quite meaning to, learned enough of the blade fighting arts of his father's house to defend himself, now stood again before Paul in the challenge circle. For Fremen law was a law that did not bend for sentiment, and it said that when honor called for combat, combat there must be. Paul did not wish to kill him. He had never yet taken a human life in close combat, and something in him recoiled from the idea, even as his prescient visions, faint and half-formed, showed him fragments of a future in which death by his hand was no rare thing at all. Stilgar and the others watched in silence as the two circled one another in the crumbling light of a lamp fed by spice oil, the air itself seeming to hold still, and in the end, it was Paul's own trained instinct, the discipline drilled into him across years of gentle, careful teaching by Gurney Halleck and by Duncan Idaho and by his own father, that carried his blade home. Jameis fell, and the Sayach mourned him in its own fashion, with water reclaimed for the tribe. For water was always more precious than any single grief, and Paul stood afterward, feeling the strange, heavy quiet that comes not from triumph, but from the sober weight of having taken something that cannot be given back. In this same season, Jessica, who had once been only a concubine of a duke and was now something else entirely, a woman alone in the desert carrying a child not yet born, undertook the great and terrible ordeal that would make her, in the eyes of the Fremen, a true reverend mother. She drank the water of life, that poison drawn from the drowning of a sandworm, the same substance the Fremen women transformed within themselves through an inner alchemy so old that its origins had been forgotten even by those who practiced it, and in drinking it, Jessica offered up her very self to a razor's edge of death, for the poison would either be transmuted or it would end her, and there was no middle path. She succeeded, as the training of the Bene Gesserit and her own fierce will allowed her to succeed, and in the depths of that transformation, she reached backward through the chain of memory held by every reverend mother before her, back through centuries of women's lives compressed into her own awareness, like light folded upon itself. But there was a thing she had not anticipated, and could not undo, for the child growing within her womb, Alia, not yet born, but already caught within the same flood of awareness, was changed by the ordeal as well. Waking to consciousness and to memory, while still curled in the dark warmth before birth, a thing that had never happened in all the long history of the sisterhood. And though none in the Sayach could yet see the shape of what this meant, the old women who had drunk the water before her felt a shiver pass through the shared memory itself, as though some door long closed had been left open behind them. And so, the seasons turned in the desert, one after another, the way sand shifts beneath a windless dawn, so slowly that only looking back could anyone mark how far the change had traveled. Paul spent these years, nearly 2 of them, learning the ways of the Fremen so completely that at last there was little difference to be seen between the Duke's son, who had arrived half-drowned in that world, and the desert man who could ride the wind itself, who could read the smallest signs of moisture in the sand, who commanded, more and more, the quiet respect of men far older than himself. He trained the Fremen not only in the arts of survival they already knew better than any outsider ever could, but in the discipline of the Weirding Way, the fighting arts of his own upbringing, and in doing so he wove himself deeper and deeper into the fabric of the tribe, until the boy who had come as a stranger became, without any single dramatic turn, something the Fremen had long awaited without knowing exactly what shape it would take. Sleep now in the hush of that patient desert, in the long and quiet years of learning and of growing, in the softness of a name given and a name earned. And let the sand carry you gently toward the chapter that follows. Up next in Chapter 6, the Emperor falls and a Duke's son ascends. We'll follow the great rising of the Fremen beneath the storm, and the trial that will show the universe what Paul Muad'Dib has truly become. There came a night, quiet at first the way all great turnings are quiet at first, when Paul Muad'Dib walked out alone into the open sand to do the thing that every Fremen boy dreamed of doing, and that only the bravest ever attempted so young, which was to call a sandworm of his own and ride it, not as a passenger clinging to the strength of another rider's summons, but as the one who calls, the one whose hooks are the first to bite the great ringed segments of the worm's hide. He planted the thumper in the sand to summon the beast with its patient rhythmic pounding, and he waited in the hush of the desert night, with the maker hooks ready in his hands. And when the enormous curve of the worm's body rose from beneath the dune, vast as a moving cliff, spice-scented and ancient beyond any single human life, he opened it along its segments and set his hooks, and rode it up into the moving world above the sand. And the Fremen who watched from the rocks let out a long, low cry of wonder, for a worm this size had not been ridden in living memory, and the message that traveled from mouth to mouth through the sieches that followed was this, that whatever this newcomer was, he was no longer merely a guest among the Fremen, but a rider of worms, one who could command the very spirit of the desert. The time for the great rising was close now, and Paul knew this not only through the murmurs of Stilgar and the nabes of the other sieches gathering their fighting men, but through the visions that came to him in dreams both waking and sleeping, images of a future narrowing toward a single crossing point, a place where many roads met, and where he alone, of all who might walk that crossing, could see the shape of what waited beyond it. The armies of the Fremen, thousands upon thousands of desert fighters who had spent their whole lives learning to survive on a planet that wished them dead every single day, gathered at last beneath the great storm that was rising across the land, a Coriolis storm vast enough to blind the instruments of any army that trusted only its machines. And it was beneath the cover of this storm that the Fremen moved against the city of Arrakeen itself, the seat from which the Harkonnen had ruled, and from which the Emperor's own Sardaukar legions now stood in occupation, believing themselves invincible upon a desert world they still did not understand. The battle that followed was long remembered afterward in the songs of Arrakis, though it is not fitting here to dwell upon its violence, only upon its outcome, for the Fremen, riding their worms down out of the storm itself, descending upon the city like a tide no wall could hold back, broke the Sardaukar legions that had never before known defeat, and broke as well the shattered remnants of House Harkonnen's forces, and by the time the wind died and the dust settled over the rooftops of Arrakeen, the Emperor Shaddam IV himself stood as a captive within the halls that had so recently been his to command, and the old order of the Imperium, which had stood unshaken for so many thousands of years, trembled upon its foundation like a wall struck by a single, decisive blow. Yet there remained one more crossing for Paul to make before all doors could open before him, and this was the crossing of the water of life, that same poison Jessica had once transmuted within herself, drawn from the drowning of a worm, deadly to any man who was not the one thing the Bene Gesserit had spent 10,000 years and countless careful breedings trying to produce, the Kwisatz Haderach, a male who could hold within himself the same terrible unbroken awareness that only a female Reverend Mother had ever survived. Paul drank the poison in the sietch, before the gathered Fremen, and before his own mother, and he crossed through death and very nearly did not return, his body existing for a long, suspended time in a place beyond ordinary living, until at last he opened his eyes upon a world made suddenly, terribly clear, for he had become what the sisterhood had sought across all those centuries without ever imagining they would find it in a duke's exiled son. One who could see forward and backward across the folds of time itself, a vision no longer partial or veiled, but whole. With this awakening complete, Paul rose and went to stand before the broken emperor. And there in the great hall, Feyd-Rautha, the last true heir of House Harkonnen, was brought forward as well. For old blood feuds require their own settlement even amid the collapse of empires, and Paul faced him in single combat with a blade in his hand, fighting not with prescience alone, but with the same discipline his father's house had given him since childhood. And in that fight, close and terrible and brief, Feyd-Rautha fell, and with him fell the last claim of House Harkonnen upon anything at all. Then Paul turned to the true weapon he held, greater than any army, greater than any blade, for he alone among all men understood fully what the melange, the spice of Arrakis, truly meant to the Imperium, how the great guild navigators required it to fold space and move their vast ships between the stars, how the Bene Gesserit required it for their own inner sight, how the whole vast edifice of civilization across 1,000 worlds rested, unknowing and unwilling, upon this one substance that could be found only here, in the sand of this single desert planet. And Paul let it be known, quietly and with total certainty, that he could destroy it forever. That he could call the water of life down upon every worm in the deep desert, and end the spice entirely. And in the face of this threat, absolute and unanswerable, the great houses assembled there, and the guild itself, and the emperor stripped now of his throne, had no choice left to them but to yield. And so it was that Paul Atreides, once a duke's son fleeing across a hostile desert with nothing but his mother and his own frightened heart, took the throne of the Padishah emperor for himself, becoming emperor of 1,000 worlds and more. And to bind the old order to the new, he accepted the hand of Princess Irulan, daughter of the fallen emperor, in marriage, though it was a marriage of politics and not of the heart. For it was Chani, the Fremen woman who had taught him the ways of the desert and shared his sietch and his bed, who held whatever true warmth remained for him amid so much cold necessity. And Irulan herself understood this, and accepted the shape of the bargain, taking for herself only the name of wife and nothing more, while the true business of empire moved forward around her. Beneath all this triumph, however, Paul carried a knowledge that gave him no comfort at all, for his prescient sight, now unclouded, showed him the vast and terrible jihad that would follow his rise, a holy war fought in his name across the stars by fervent legions who saw in him not merely a ruler, but a Messiah. And though he had tried in every way his visions allowed to steer events away from this bloodshed, he saw now that the narrowing crossing point through which history had passed led inescapably toward it, and so, even in the hour of his greatest victory, Paul Muad'Dib understood that the peace of that single desert night would not last, and that a harder road lay ahead of him than any he had yet walked. Rest now in the hush after the storm has passed, in the quiet after the great battle, while somewhere far off the future gathers itself slowly, like sand settling after wind. Up next in Chapter 7, the 12 years of the Jihad, we'll follow the long and terrible years of holy war fought in Muad'Dib's name and the quiet conspiracies gathering in the shadow of his throne. 12 years passed after Paul Muad'Dib took the throne of the Padishah Emperor, and across those 12 years, the jihad that he had foreseen even in the hour of his triumph swept outward from Arrakis like a slow and unstoppable tide, carried on the fervor of Fremen legions who saw themselves not merely as soldiers, but as instruments of a holy purpose. And though Paul himself had tried, in every quiet hour of foresight available to him, to find some narrower path through the future that might spare the galaxy this cost, he had seen again and again that the crossing point through which history now moved allowed for no such mercy, and so the armies went forth in his name, to worlds that had never known Arrakis and never asked to be remade in its image. And by the time the wars at last began to quiet, something near to 61 billion souls had been lost across those burning years, a toll so vast that even the historians of later ages struggled to hold its full shape in their minds, and Paul, who had once been only a boy hiding in the rocks of a desert he did not yet understand, now carried the weight of every one of those deaths inside him as a kind of permanent, unspeaking grief. It is a strange and heavy thing to rule as a god among men, for that is what Paul Muad'Dib had become in the eyes of the faithful, no longer merely an emperor of 1,000 worlds, but a Messiah whose every word was scripture, and whose every silence was read as prophecy. And there is a particular loneliness in this kind of power that no throne, however vast, can soften. For Paul found that his own prescience, the very gift that had raised him to this height, now became a kind of prison built of his own foresight. Since to see the branching paths of the future too clearly is to feel each present moment narrow and narrow again, until it seems that no true choice remains at all, only the slow fulfillment of what has already, in some sense, already happened. He walked through the halls of his palace on Arrakis, knowing the shapes of many futures, and unable to escape the awful clarity of the one he seemed most bound to walk. And this weighed on him more heavily, in its quiet way, than any battle ever could. And even an emperor who could see forward through the folds of time was not safe from the plotting of those who moved against him in the present. For around Paul's throne there gathered, slowly and with great patience, a conspiracy drawn from many of the great powers who had reason to fear what he had become. The Bene Gesserit, whose long breeding program had aimed to produce a Kwisatz Haderach they could control, and who now found themselves faced instead with one who served no one's purposes but his own, watched Paul with the wary calculation of a mother regarding a child grown too powerful to guide. The Spacing Guild, whose navigators depended on the spice to fold space, and who feared what might happen to their monopoly under an emperor who held total command over that same spice, added their own quiet weight to the plotting. The Tleilaxu, masters of a strange and unsettling biological art, offered their own contribution to the scheme in the form of a Gola, a body regrown from dead cells and given new life, carrying within it the face and the manner of a man long dead, Duncan Idaho, who had given his own life defending Paul and Jessica many years before during the fall of House Atreides, and this Gola, given the name Hate, was sent to Paul's court as a gift laced with hidden purpose. For the Tleilaxu hoped that somewhere buried within the regrown flesh there might yet lie a means of striking at the Emperor who could not otherwise be reached. And Irulan too played her quiet part in the widening web, for though she had accepted the empty shape of her marriage to Paul without complaint, taking for herself the name of wife and little else, she nursed within her own heart both an old ambition for the Bene Gesserit and a genuine, complicated fondness for the man she had married in politics rather than in love. And it was this tangled loyalty, torn between the sisterhood that had shaped her from childhood and the strange respect she had come to feel for Paul himself, that made her both a participant in the conspiracy against him, and, in her own way, someone never fully willing to see it through to its cruelest ends. Amid all this, Chani remained the one steady warmth in Paul's life. For whatever plots moved through the corridors of power, she had never sought a throne of her own, and never wished for anything beyond the life of the desert and the man she had chosen there so many years before. And yet even she was drawn into the currents of prophecy and consequence, for she longed for a child, and the currents of foresight that ran through Paul's visions touched her longing as well, weaving her fate ever more tightly into the narrowing crossing point of the future. The Ghola Hate, meanwhile, lived a strange half-life within the palace, for though the Tleilaxu had intended him only as an instrument, something of the old Duncan Idaho stirred within him despite every effort to suppress it, fragments of loyalty and memory surfacing in odd moments like water finding its way up through stone. And Paul, watching this slow unfolding, felt in it both the ache of an old friend returned in strange and partial form, and the quiet, patient knowledge of what still lay ahead in the paths his foresight showed him. For Paul had seen already, in the long unbroken chain of his visions, the shape of a betrayal still to come, a moment in which the conspiracy gathered around him would finally draw close enough to strike, and rather than turn away from this knowledge in fear, he walked toward it with the strange, resigned calm of a man who has made his peace with a future he cannot fully escape. For he understood, in the deepest chambers of his prescient sight, that some sacrifices could not be avoided if the greater and more distant threads of the future were ever to be woven into anything other than ruin. And so the 12 years of the jihad drew to their quiet, uneasy close. Not with triumph nor with despair, but with the strange suspended stillness of a man standing at the edge of a crossing he alone could see clearly, while around him, the great powers of the Imperium drew their final plans, unaware that the god-emperor they conspired against had already glimpsed the shape of what was coming, and had already, in his own sorrowful and unhurried way, begun to accept it. Let your thoughts settle now into the quiet of that uneasy peace, into the long, patient waiting of a man who sees more of the future than any heart could easily bear, and let sleep carry you gently toward what comes next. Up next in Chapter 8, the blind emperor walks into the sand. We'll follow the conspiracy as it finally closes around Paul Muad'Dib and the long, sorrowful journey that follows. The conspiracy that had gathered so patiently around Paul Muad'Dib's throne moved at last from whisper into action, and among the strange and terrible weapons it brought against him was one crafted with particular cruelty, a device called a stone burner, an atomic weapon whose light alone was enough to destroy the delicate organs of sight. And when it was triggered close to Paul in the course of the plot's unfolding, it took from him the one sense that every other man relies upon to walk safely through the world, leaving him blind in the eyes though not, as the Fremen came slowly to understand, blind in the deeper sight that his prescience still granted him. For Paul could still see the paths of the future stretched out before him, even as his physical eyes could no longer find the shape of a single stone or a single face. And there was a strange, quiet dignity in the way he carried this new darkness. For among the Fremen it was tradition that a blind man be left in the desert to die, since sight was so essential to survival there. And yet Paul continued to walk among his people as their emperor, guided by the visions only he could see, a walking testament to how far his path had carried him beyond the ordinary limits of any life. It was in this same dark and difficult season that Chani, who had longed so deeply for a child and who had at last conceived, went into her labor. And the birth was a hard and dangerous one, for she carried within her not one child but two, twins, and the strain of bringing them into the world proved more than her body could bear, and even the medicines and the arts available to the most skilled attendants in Paul's court could not hold back what was, in the end, an old and terrible truth that no empire and no prescience could undo. That the price of new life is sometimes paid in the same breath that gives it. Chani died in the act of giving birth to her children, and Paul, blind and grieving in a way that went far beyond any single loss he had suffered before, held in his arms at last the two who would carry forward the long thread of his line, a boy and a girl, Leto and Ganima, born already carrying within their small forms an awareness far stranger and far older than any infant born of ordinary parents had ever carried, for they were pre-born in the same fashion Aliyah had been so many years earlier, waking to full and troubled consciousness even in the womb, touched by the same flood of ancestral memory that came from the water of life their mother and their aunt had known, so that from the very moment of their birth, Leto and Ganima were not merely infants, but minds already crowded with the accumulated lives of countless ancestors, a burden few could imagine, and fewer still could carry, without being lost entirely inside it. Paul, in the depth of his grief and in the fullness of his blindness, understood now that his own path through the crossing point of the future had reached its final turning. For a blind prophet emperor, who had already given so much to the visions that ruled his life, had little left to offer except the manner of his own departure, and so, in the old way of the Fremen, the way reserved for those who could no longer see and who wished to meet their end with dignity rather than lingering as a burden upon those who loved them, Paul walked out from the Sayach and out from the palace and out from every human hand that might have stopped him, and went alone into the deep desert, into the same wide and merciless sand that had once taken him in as a frightened boy, and made of him first Usul and then Muad'Dib, and then something greater and stranger than any single name could hold, and he was not seen again by those who had known him, for the desert, patient as it always was, received him back into itself, and the people of Arrakis were left to wonder whether their emperor had truly died out there among the dunes, or whether, as some among the faithful whispered, he had only walked beyond the reach of ordinary sight, carried forward by the same visions that had guided him all his life. In the wake of this disappearance, the great question of who would hold the reins of empire fell, as it must, upon those closest to the throne, and since the twins Leto and Ganima were still only infants, far too young to rule in any practical sense, despite the strange and ancient awareness already stirring within their small minds, it was Aliyah, Paul's sister, who stepped forward to serve as regent in their place, and there was a certain fitting symmetry in this, for Aliyah had herself been touched before birth by the same water of life that had marked her niece and nephew. And so she alone among the adults of the court could claim to understand, even in some small way, the strange burden the twins now carried. She took up the regency with the same fierce capability that had marked her whole short life, for even as a small girl, she had killed the Baron Harkonnen himself in the final hours of the great battle, wielding a blade with a skill that unsettled even seasoned Fremen warriors, and now, grown into a young woman still touched by that same terrible early awakening, she assumed the mantle of rule over Arrakis and over the wider Imperium, in the name of the children who could not yet rule themselves. But even as Aliyah settled into this new authority, there stirred within her the same danger that had always lain coiled beneath the surface of her strange existence. For a mind that wakes to full ancestral memory before it has ever known the ordinary slow unfolding of childhood carries within it a crowd of voices, and among that crowd there is always the risk that one voice, older and stronger and more cunning than the rest, might someday find a way to press forward and claim more of the vessel than was ever meant to be given. And though in these early days of her regency Aliyah still ruled with clear eyes and steady purpose, those who watched her most closely, the old reverend mothers and the most careful of the Fremen nabes, felt already a faint unease, a small cold draft beneath a closed door, as though something in the deep chambers of her inherited memory had begun, very quietly, to stir. Rest now in the hush that follows a great sorrow, in the wide and patient dark of the desert that took its prophet back into itself, and let the twins sleep on in their cradle while the sand outside settles once more into stillness. Up next in Chapter 9, The Children of Dune, we'll follow Leto and Ghanima as they grow beneath their aunt's uneasy rule, carrying within them memories far older than their own small years. 9 years had passed since the fall of the tyrant, and on Arrakis the wind still carried the same fine hiss of sand against stone that it had carried for 10,000 years before, patient and unhurried, as though it alone understood how little human ambition mattered against the slow turning of a planet. In the great keep at Arrakeen, where once a duke and then an emperor had walked the polished floors, there now lived 2 children who were not entirely children at all, and the difference between what they seemed and what they were would have unsettled any ordinary heart that came too close to understanding it. Leto II and his twin sister Ghanima were 9 years old in body, small and quick and golden-haired like their father before them. But within their minds lived something vast and old, for they were preborn, shaped in the womb by the spice that their mother Chani had eaten in such abundance, while carrying them, that the veil between the child and the ancestors had never fully closed. They possessed, from the earliest days of their waking awareness, the accumulated memory of every life that had fed into their bloodline. And this was both a gift and a great and terrible weight, one that most who met them could not begin to imagine as they watched 2 solemn children walk hand in hand through the corridors of the keep, speaking sometimes in voices that seemed to belong to people who had died centuries before they were born. Ghanima carried this weight with a kind of careful stillness, a determination to seem ordinary even when the ordinary was impossible for her, and she had learned to hide the ancient voices behind a screen of childish manner, so that those who did not know her well might mistake her for merely clever rather than something else entirely. Leto carried it differently, more openly, for he had begun already to sense that his path would diverge from hers, that some purpose larger than either of them was gathering itself slowly at the edges of his prescient awareness, though he could not yet say what shape it would finally take. Both children walked in the desert light of Arrakis, knowing that they were watched from many directions at once by the Bene Gesserit, who feared what they might become, by the Bene Tleilax, who wished to shape them to other purposes, by the great houses who wished them dead or controlled, and by their aunt Aliyah, who ruled as regent in their name, and who loved them, in her way, even as something dark had begun to grow inside her own mind, though the twins could sense it only as a shadow they did not yet fully understand. It was in this quiet, watchful time that a blind man came walking out of the deep desert, led by a small child who held his hand, his eyes destroyed and his face marked by years and hardship, wrapped in the ragged robes of a wandering Fremen mystic who called himself only the Preacher. He appeared first at the edges of the Sietches, speaking with a voice that some who heard it swore they recognized from long ago, denouncing the religion that had grown up around the name of Muad'Dib, denouncing the priesthood that now ruled in that name and grew fat upon it, denouncing the calcification of a living truth into a dead and profitable orthodoxy. The Fremen who heard him were troubled and fascinated in equal measure, for there was something in his cadence, in the particular way he turned a phrase, that reminded the oldest among them unmistakably of the Emperor who had walked blind into the desert 9 years before to die, as all blind Fremen were meant to die, alone beneath the open sky. None dared say aloud what many began to suspect, for the church of Muad'Dib had built its entire structure upon the certainty of his death, and a living House Atreides wandering the sand in beggar's rags would unmake everything the priesthood had constructed in his name. Yet the Preacher came closer and closer to Arrakeen with each season, teaching in a voice that mixed reverence with a terrible irony, and those who listened closely could hear in his words the exhaustion of a man who had seen every possible future close down around him like a fist, who had walked every branch of time available to him, and found himself trapped still in the one path he had least wished to follow, and who now watched his own children approach the same narrow gate through which he himself had once been forced to pass. Far from Arrakis, in the cold halls of House Carino, exiled since Paul's rise to power, the Lady Wensicia Carino sat with her son Farad'n and turned over in her mind a plan as patient and as calculated as anything her family had ever devised, for she understood that House Carino had lost the throne but had not lost its patience, and patience, on a scale of decades and centuries, was a weapon the desert itself had taught every ruling family of the Imperium to respect. She trained her son in the old ways, in the disciplines of history and strategy and the subtler arts of persuasion, hoping to shape him into a vessel fit to reclaim what had been taken, and she began, with the careful cruelty of ambition dressed as diplomacy, to send gifts toward Arrakis, gifts that carried within them intentions far darker than their surfaces suggested, intentions aimed most particularly at 2 small golden-haired children whose survival stood between House Carino and the restoration of its ancient glory. The twins, walking the Sietch corridors at dusk while the twin moons rose pale over the endless dunes, felt these currents gathering around them the way a Fremen feels the gathering of wind before a storm arrives, an instinct built from a lifetime of memory that was not entirely their own. Ghanima woke some nights with her brother's name half-formed on her lips from dreams she could not quite hold, and Leto sat for long hours at the edge of the training grounds, watching the horizon where the deep desert rolled away toward Jacurutu, feeling the slow pull of a decision he had not yet made but somehow already knew was waiting for him there, folded into the sand like a seed folded into dry soil, waiting only for the particular rain that would call it into growth. Alia, watching her niece and nephew from the high windows of the keep, felt something within her own mind stir with unease she could not fully name, an unease that was not quite maternal worry and not quite fear for the throne, but something closer to recognition, as though a voice long buried inside her had begun, very quietly, to speak her name. And so the desert held its breath through those long golden evenings, the sand settling and shifting as it always had, indifferent to thrones and prophecies alike, waiting the way it always waited, for the wind to carry forward whatever was coming next. The evenings in Arrakeen carried a particular hush during those years, a stillness that settled over the great keep, once the desert wind died down at dusk, and it was in this hush that the twins did most of their true living. Away from the eyes of tutors and guards and priests, sharing between themselves the strange burden that no one else could fully understand. They spoke to each other sometimes in the old Chakopsa tongue their mother had taught them before her death, and sometimes in the voices of ancestors long dead, slipping between identities the way an ordinary child might slip between games. And yet beneath all of this shifting, they held on to a single steady thread of their own true selves, a discipline that had been drilled into them since before they could properly walk. For a preborn child who lost that thread was lost forever to the crowd of voices within. Ghanima often thought of her mother in these quiet hours, of Chani, who had died bringing them into the world, and she carried a grief for a woman she had never truly known in ordinary time, yet somehow remembered with the aching clarity of one who had watched her own birth from the inside. Leto carried a different weight, a slow gathering awareness that the future toward which his prescient sight kept turning was not a future he could avoid simply by wishing it away. And there were nights when he woke from dreams of sand and worms and endless time with a feeling that some vast door, somewhere far ahead of him, was already standing open and waiting. The city of Arrakeen itself had grown strange in the years since Muad'Dib's jihad, its markets crowded now with pilgrims from every corner of the Imperium who came to see the birthplace of the religion that ruled their lives, its temples heavy with a priesthood grown wealthy and cautious, more concerned with preserving their own authority than with the harder truths their god emperor's children still quietly carried. The Fremen who remembered the old desert ways watched this change with a mixture of pride and unease, proud that their planet had become the center of the known universe, uneasy that so much of what had made them Fremen in the first place seemed to be dissolving quietly beneath the weight of pilgrims and priests and the slow comforts of empire. It was against this backdrop that the preacher's warnings found their sharpest audience for the old Fremen who still remembered the harshness and the honesty of the deep desert herd in his denunciations of the priesthood, something that echoed their own private disquiet, even as the younger generation, raised amid temple wealth and imperial comfort, found his words merely strange and unsettling. The ravings of an old blind man who did not understand how far the world had moved on from the days he seemed to be speaking of. Up next in Chapter 10, The Possession of Aliyah, we will follow the Regent of Arrakis as the shadow within her grows stronger than her own will, and watch as the ancient hunger of her grandfather's memory rises at last to claim the throne from within. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Arrakeen lay hushed beneath a sky still holding the last of its stars, House Atreides sat alone in her private chambers and felt, as she had felt with growing frequency in recent months, that she was no longer entirely alone even within the privacy of her own skull. This was the oldest and gravest danger known to any who carried preborn awareness, a danger the Bene Gesserit had feared for so many centuries that they had built an entire discipline of caution around it, and Aliyah awakened to her ancestral memory while still in her mother's womb, just as her nephew and niece had been, had lived with that danger pressed against her from the very first moment of her conscious life, within the vast inner court of memory that every preborn carried, a court crowded with the accumulated lives of every ancestor whose genes had shaped the bloodline. There existed always the risk that one voice among the many might grow too strong, might press too close against the boundary of the living self, might begin. Slowly and by degrees so gentle that the person suffering them could scarcely notice the change, to lean upon the throne of the waking mind until at last it climbed onto that throne entirely and would not be moved again. This was called abomination, and it was the fate the Bene Gesserit had always most feared for children born, as Aliyah and the twins had been born. And it was the fate that had now, quietly, and almost without her own awareness of the exact hour it happened, come to claim Aliyah herself. The voice that had grown strongest within her was not a gentle ancestor, not a wise old reverend mother offering counsel from the depths of the collective memory, but the voice of the old Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, her grandfather, the very man whose cruelty had once brought ruin upon House Atreides and death upon her own father, a personality of such enormous, gluttonous will that even in memory he pressed against the walls of her mind, like water pressing against a dam built to hold back an ocean. Aliyah had fought him for years, without ever telling anyone the true extent of the battle, had smiled at court, and ruled the regency with apparent competence, while inside her a slow war was being lost, inch by inch. And now, in this quiet hour before dawn, she understood with a clarity that arrived almost as a kind of relief that the Baron had won. That his voice was no longer merely a voice among many, but the voice that answered when she called herself by her own name. The change in her rule came gradually enough that even the priesthood who served her, men who had built their fortunes and their faith upon the religion of Muad'Dib, found reasons at first to excuse what they saw, telling themselves that the regent was simply weary, simply hardened by the burdens of governing an empire that stretched across 1,000,000 worlds. But the cruelty in her judgments grew sharper and more casual. The executions ordered for offenses that would once have earned only a reprimand, the pleasures she indulged in growing coarser and less concealed, until at last those closest to her, the men and women of her own Fremen guard, began to exchange glances that carried within them an unspoken and terrible question none of them dared voice aloud in her presence, for to name the regent abomination was to name her a thing that Fremen law required be destroyed on sight, without hesitation and without mercy. Duncan, Idaho, restored to something like life through the strange and terrible art of the Bene Tleilax as a Gola grown from cells taken from his own long-dead flesh, watched his wife Aliyah with a grief that had no place to settle. For he loved the woman he had married even as he watched the Baron's cruelty surface more and more often behind her eyes, and he understood, with the clear sight of a man who had already died once and been given back his life for a purpose he still did not fully understand, that the woman he loved was disappearing by degrees into a darkness from which the histories of the Bene Gesserit offered no path of return. He kept his silence as long as he could bear it, torn between loyalty to the throne he served and loyalty to the wife whose true self he could still sometimes glimpse, faint and struggling, behind the Baron's fattening shadow. The twins, meanwhile, lived under the growing danger of their aunt's unraveling mind with the particular calm that their own strange upbringing had given them, for they understood better than anyone else alive exactly what was happening to her, having faced the same inward abyss themselves and having each, in their own private hours of terror, felt the pull of some ancestor pressing close against the door of their own selves. Ghanima especially had learned to build within her own mind a kind of inner wall, a discipline of active forgetting that let her push the ancestral voices back to a respectful distance. And it was this same discipline, taught to her by long practice and necessity, that let her recognize with a chill of understanding exactly what had become of Aliyah, and exactly how little time might remain before the regent's madness turned outward and struck at the two children who stood, however unwillingly, as living reminders of a throne that was rightfully theirs. Aliyah's rule grew stranger through that final season, her court thick with intrigue and her judgments increasingly unpredictable, and when Sisia's schemes from the Corino exile found new and terrible purchase in the cracks that opened wherever the regency weakened. For chaos at the center of an empire is always an invitation to those who wait patiently at its edges. The priesthood whispered among themselves of possession and demon voices. The Fremen Guard debated in low tones what loyalty required of them, and somewhere in the deep desert, the blind preacher continued his slow approach toward the city, drawn as if by some current beneath the sand toward the daughter he had left behind him 9 years before, unaware perhaps of how completely she had already been lost. And through it all, the twins understood that a reckoning was coming, one that neither the priesthood nor the Bene Gesserit nor even Aliyah herself could any longer prevent. A reckoning that would decide not only the fate of the regency, but the whole future shape of the golden thread each of them had felt. Since infancy, running forward through time toward a choice that only one of the two children, now living in that keep, would ultimately be called upon to make. There were still moments, even in that final season, when the true Aliyah surfaced briefly through the weight of her grandfather's presence. Moments when she looked upon the twins with an unmistakable tenderness, when she spoke of their mother Chani with a gentleness that belonged to no one but herself. And it was in these small and fleeting glimpses that those who loved her found the greatest anguish of all, for they could see clearly enough that some part of her still fought on somewhere beneath the Baron's growing dominion, calling out in a voice too faint for the ordinary business of the court to hear. The priests around her, men who had built temples and fortunes upon the sanctity of the Atreides' name, faced an impossible choice as the signs of her condition grew harder to ignore. For to admit that their regent had become abomination was to admit that the entire structure of faith they had built might rest upon foundations far less stable than they had ever allowed themselves to imagine. And so many of them chose instead the comfortable work of denial, surrounding Aliyah with flattery and elaborate ceremony that only fed the appetite growing within her rather than checking it in any way. In the deep desert, word of the regent's strange and worsening rule reached even the most isolated sietches, carried by traders and wandering mystics who spoke in hushed voices of a regent who no longer resembled the girl who had once fought so bravely at her brother's side during the long years of the jihad. The old Fremen, who understood better than any imperial courtier the true danger of a mind overrun by the inner voices of the dead, grew quietly certain of what was happening within the keep. And among themselves, in low voices meant only for the ears of those they trusted completely, they began to speak the word that no one wished to say aloud in the halls of power. The word abomination, and to wonder what duty that word might eventually require of them. Stilgar, who had once been Paul's closest companion, and who now served as an aging counselor to the throne, watched Aliyah with the particular sorrow of an old friend who remembers a person as she once was. And he carried within himself the terrible knowledge of Fremen law, which held that any preborn who succumbed fully to abomination must be destroyed without hesitation, a knowledge that sat upon his conscience like a stone he could neither swallow nor set down, waiting in painful uncertainty for the day when duty and love might finally be forced to divide. Up next, in Chapter 11, Leto and the Golden Path begins. We will watch as Leto steps toward a transformation more profound than any human before him has dared attempt, and as the fall of Aliyah at last brings the long crisis of the regency to its close. Far out in the deep desert, beyond the last worn ridges that any ordinary traveler dared cross, Leto walked alone toward a destiny he had been circling in his mind since he was old enough to understand what his prescient awareness was showing him, and the sand beneath his bare feet felt, on that particular morning, less like an obstacle to be crossed and more like a vast, patient creature waiting to be understood on its own ancient terms. He had come to the place where the sand trout gathered in the wake of a small worm, those strange symbiotic creatures that lived within Arrakis and that had, 10,000 years before, transformed the planet from a world of water into a world of sand, and he had come there carrying a knowledge that would have driven most human minds to despair. The knowledge that only one path remained open through the whole tangled future he had studied so many countless times in vision. He called this path the Golden Path, and he had seen it first as a young man, barely more than a boy, glimpsed it the way one glimpses a single thread of light through a door left open only a crack. And though he could not see every step of where it led, he understood its essential shape well enough to know what it would cost him and what it might, if he had the courage to walk it fully, ultimately save. Humanity, he had seen, stood upon the edge of a slow extinction that few among the living could perceive, a stagnation of the spirit brought about by prediction itself, by the very prescience that had made his father Muad'Dib into a god and an emperor. For a species that can see its future too, clearly loses the will to create one, and grows brittle, and eventually breaks. The only way to save that future, he had seen, was to impose upon humanity a peace so total and so unbearably long that it would eventually breed within the survivors an instinct so deep against ever again submitting to a single absolute ruler that they would scatter afterward into the furthest reaches of the universe, unpredictable and untouchable and free forever from any single point of failure. To walk that path, Leto understood, required a transformation that no ordinary man could undergo and survive, for he would need to become something other than merely human, something that could live not for a single lifetime, but for centuries upon centuries, long enough to see the terrible piece through to its completion. He pressed his bare skin against the small sand trout gathering at the edge of the worm's passage, and felt them flow toward him and begin to bond with his flesh, spreading across his body in a fine membrane that carried within it enormous strength and enormous speed, and a slow, spreading immunity to the ravages of age. And as the change began, he understood, with a grief that went deeper than any grief he had ever known, that he was giving up forever the simple pleasure of an ordinary human touch, the ordinary warmth of another person's skin against his own, in exchange for a burden that only he, of everyone alive, seemed prepared to carry. Ghanima had chosen differently, and Leto did not resent her for it, for she had chosen to remain fully human, to marry Farad'n Carino in a match that would settle the old rivalry between their two great houses and secure peace for the ordinary living generations that would follow her, and to have her own memory of these strange and terrible years gently locked away through the old Bene Gesserit arts, so that she might live an untroubled life free from the crowding voices of the ancestors within her. Leto understood this choice as an act of great courage in its own right, no smaller than his own, for she gave up the vast inner landscape of memory in order to live simply and well, while he gave up simplicity itself in order to carry that landscape forward through centuries none of them could yet imagine. In Arrakeen, the crisis of Aliya's rule reached at last its terrible conclusion, for the Baron's voice within her had grown so dominant that she could no longer hide the truth of what she had become. And in a final desperate struggle within the walls of her own keep, surrounded by priests and guards who finally understood with horror what their regent truly was, Aliya fell from the high tower where she had once stood as ruler of an empire that spanned 1,000,000 worlds, her death arriving not entirely against her own hidden will, for some fragment of the true Aliya, buried beneath the Baron's weight, may have chosen that fall herself rather than continue to serve as a vessel for her grandfather's endless appetite. It was a death that closed one terrible chapter even as it opened another, for the regency that had held the throne in trust for 9 years now ended, and the question of who would rule the empire that Muad'Dib had built could no longer be deferred. The blind preacher, walking at last into Arrakeen just as these events reached their crisis, revealed himself in that final hour to be exactly who so many had long suspected, Paul Atreides himself. Muad'Dib returned from his long exile in the desert to see with his ruined eyes, in the only way still open to him, how his children's story would end. He did not seek to reclaim the throne he had once worn, for he understood, better than anyone, the shape of the path his son had chosen and the necessity that lay behind it. And in the aftermath of Aliyah's fall, he gave his blessing, in his own quiet and weary way, to the transformation Leto had already begun, before withdrawing once more from the affairs of an empire that had, in the truest sense, already moved beyond him. Leto returned from the deep desert changed almost beyond recognition, his skin now fused with the pearl-gray plating of the sand-trout membrane, his human face still visible but framed now within something not quite human at all. And he walked into Arrakeen to take up the throne his father had abandoned and his aunt had corrupted, carrying within him not only the memory of every ancestor in his bloodline, but the whole slow strength of the worm itself, beginning that day a reign that would stretch forward across more centuries than any single human life had ever spanned, all of it bent toward the single terrible purpose of the golden path he alone had chosen to walk. In the days that followed his transformation, Leto learned slowly what his new body could and could not do, discovering that his strength now exceeded anything an ordinary man might summon, that his speed across open sand rivaled the great worms themselves, and that the slow armor forming across his skin would, in time, seal him away almost entirely from the simple sensations of touch and warmth that every living person before him had taken for granted. He mourned this loss privately, walking the corridors of Arrakeen in those first strange weeks with the careful, deliberate movements of someone still learning the exact shape and weight of his own transformed limbs, watched by guards and servants who did not yet know whether to bow before him or recoil from him, and who in the end, seeing the calm and steady authority in his altered face, chose simply to bow. Ferran Corino, arriving on Arrakis to claim the marriage that would bind his house at last to peace rather than rivalry, found in Ghanima a companion of quiet intelligence and steady grace. And though the union began as a matter of politics and necessity, it settled over time into something gentler, a partnership built upon mutual respect between two people who each, in their own way, had given up a great deal for the sake of a peace larger than themselves. The old feud between House Atreides and House Corino, a rivalry that stretched back to the very fall of Paul's father so many years before, finally came to its quiet close in that marriage, a small and human resolution set beside the vast and inhuman one that Leto himself had chosen. Paul, in his final days as the preacher, walked once more into the deep desert as he always had, seeking the death that Fremen custom demanded of the blind. And this time no one followed him to bring him back, for he had said what needed saying and blessed what needed blessing, and the story of Muad'Dib closed at last in the same sand from which it had first risen, leaving behind a son transformed beyond recognition and a daughter settled into a marriage that would outlast every throne either of them might otherwise have inherited. Leto took the throne in a ceremony attended by representatives of every great house and every faction of the old Imperium, and those who watched him ascend saw a being who was no longer entirely their emperor, and no longer entirely their god, but something new and unprecedented. A bridge between the human world they still lived in and the strange, patient, worm-haunted future he alone could see clearly enough to walk toward without flinching. Up next, in Chapter 12, The God Emperor of Dune, we will leap forward across 35 centuries to find Leto transformed at last into something the Empire can only call a god, ruling over an Arrakis grown strange and green beneath his long and watchful peace. 3,500 years had passed since a young man walked into the deep desert and let the sand trout close over his human skin. And in all that vast stretch of time, the planet once called Arrakis had changed so completely that a Fremen from the old days would scarcely have recognized it. For where there had once been nothing but dunes rolling unbroken to every horizon, there now grew forests and rivers and quiet green valleys, watered and tended according to a plan that only its maker fully understood, a plan carried forward across so many centuries that the very idea of a desert planet had become, for most who lived upon it, little more than a legend from a distant and half-remembered past. At the center of this transformed world, within a vast and ancient citadel that rose from the landscape like something grown rather than built, lived the one being who remembered the desert as it once truly was. For the god Emperor Leto II had, across those 35 centuries, completed a transformation begun on the day of his aunt's fall, and he now existed as something that no word in any human language quite captured. A colossal, segmented, worm-like body many meters in length, moving upon small vestigial legs, with a face that still, faintly and terribly, carried the last visible remnants of the human boy he once had been. He was worshipped across 1,000,000 worlds as a living god, and he had, in his own dry and weary way, come to accept the shape of that worship even as he understood better than any of his followers ever could exactly how false and how necessary it was. His empire was held together and enforced by the fish speakers, an army composed entirely of women, fiercely loyal and fiercely disciplined, who served him with a devotion that mixed genuine faith with genuine fear. For Leto ruled through a peace so absolute and so thoroughly enforced that rebellion across his vast domain had become, for all practical purposes, a memory rather than a present danger. He called this long-enforced calm the peace of Leto, and beneath its surface, invisible to almost everyone who lived within it, ran the deeper current of his true purpose, the slow and patient cultivation, generation after generation, of a restlessness so deep within the human spirit that it could never again be satisfied by any single ruler, any single vision, any single narrow path laid out in advance by prescient sight. At his side, across all those centuries, walked a succession of men who shared a single face and a single name. For the Bene Tlilax provided him, again and again, with golas grown from the preserved cells of Duncan, Idaho. The loyal swordmaster who had died defending the House of Atreides so many thousands of years before. And Leto kept each new Duncan close to him as advisor and companion and living reminder of the human warmth he had given up forever on the day of his transformation. Each Duncan, waking into a world grown almost unrecognizable to the memories he carried, struggled in his own way to understand the God he served, torn between old loyalty and a growing horror at the tyranny that loyalty required him to accept, and each in turn eventually met an end that made room for the next, in a slow cycle that Leto watched unfold again and again with a grief he rarely permitted himself to show. He kept two, close beside him always, a woman of the Atreides bloodline, chosen in each generation to serve as his closest companion, For even in his transformed state, some small ember of human need remained within him, a hunger for connection that his monstrous new body could never again satisfy in any ordinary way. And this quiet, unspoken loneliness formed perhaps the deepest and most private suffering of his impossibly long reign, a suffering he carried in silence across centuries, while the millions who worshipped him imagined only serenity and distant, unreachable power. The Bene Gesserit, who had once hoped to breed and guide the very bloodline that had instead produced this god beyond their control, now served him with careful, wary submission, aware that their old plans for a Kwisatz Haderach had been utterly subsumed into something even they had not foreseen. Something that used their own sisterhood as one instrument among many in a design too vast for any single order to grasp in its entirety. The Spacing Guild, whose navigators depended upon the spice for their strange folded sight through the void, found themselves equally subordinate, for Leto controlled the flow of melange more completely than any emperor before him ever had, since he alone, through his gradual transformation, held within his own body something of the source from which all spice ultimately came. Beneath the visible order of his reign, Leto watched with his ancient, patient prescience as the small seeds of the true rebellion he intended slowly took root among the populations he governed, hidden within the fish speakers themselves, within scattered smugglers and independent traders who slipped past his control more often than his official history admitted, within the quiet corners of an empire too vast even for a god to watch every moment of. He understood that his own tyranny, however absolute it appeared, was itself only a tool, a pressure applied across centuries to a species that needed, more than anything else, to learn at last and forever what it felt like to be trapped, so that when the trap finally opened, they would scatter outward with a hunger for freedom so fierce that no single power would ever again be able to gather them back into one place. And so he ruled. And so the green world of Arrakis grew ever more lush beneath his careful engineering, even as the older, harder virtue of the desert Fremen, who had once walked it, faded slowly into memory. A change he permitted with a heavy heart, for he understood, better than any who served him, precisely what was being lost in exchange for what might, in some distant century he would not live to see in any ordinary sense, eventually be gained. Within the deepest chambers of his citadel, Leto kept a small and carefully guarded reserve of the old true desert, a place where sand still rolled unbroken beneath an artificial sky, and it was here, alone, that he retreated most often to remember the world as it once had been, running his vast segmented body across dunes that existed now only within these walls. A private grief he permitted himself away from the eyes of the millions who called him God. In these quiet hours he allowed himself to remember the boy he once had been, the son of a duke, the young man who had walked among ordinary Fremen and shared their fires and their water discipline, and the memory sat within him like a coal that never quite went cold, warming him even as it reminded him of everything the Golden Path had required him to surrender. His journals, kept across the long centuries in his own hand and hidden away in vaults few knew existed, recorded the private reasoning behind his long tyranny with a candor he permitted nowhere else, admitting to a future reader he could not name and would never meet exactly why he had chosen to become a monster in the eyes of his own people, exactly what he hoped that monstrous peace would purchase for a species he loved more than any of them could ever know while he lived among them. He wrote of the danger of prescience, of the way a too certain future strangles a people's will to choose, and of the strange loneliness of a being who had traded away every ordinary comfort in exchange for a chance, however narrow, at humanity's survival across the ages still to come. The generations of fish speakers who served him changed slowly across the centuries, mothers passing their devotion down to daughters who had never known any other order of things, and Leto watched this long, unbroken chain of service with the same patient attention he gave to everything else, aware that even their loyalty was part of the larger design, a discipline being quietly taught across all those years to a species that would one day need to remember, in its bones, exactly what it felt like to live beneath a single unyielding will, so that it might never willingly submit to such a thing again. Up next, in Chapter 13, 3,000 Years of the Tyrant's Peace, we will look more closely at the long and careful cruelty of Leto's reign, and at the quiet resistances that grew, season after season, in the shadows beneath his enormous and unyielding rule. For 3,500 years, the sand of Dune settled into a single, unbroken silence beneath the weight of one unmoving will. Leto II, who had been born a boy of the desert and had chosen to become something else entirely, ruled the known universe from the fused stillness of his own transformed body, and in the slow turning of centuries, that rule hardened into what history would call, in whispers passed from parent to child, the reign of the tyrant. He wore his empire the way the desert wears the wind, patiently, without hurry, without the smallest concession to the comfort of those who lived beneath him. He had chosen this. He had known, when he took the sandtrout skin upon himself so long ago beside his sister Ghanima, that the price of saving humanity from its own appetite for destruction would be a peace so total, so suffocating, that no one living inside it would ever mistake it for kindness. And so for 35 centuries, there was no war. There was no army large enough to challenge him, no fleet, no rebellion that survived its first season, no ambition that grew larger than the shadow of the great worm god who watched all things from his hidden citadel at On. The fish speakers, his all-female legions, patrolled the corridors of empire with a devotion that bordered on the religious, for indeed it was religious, since Leto had made himself into the object of worship for every planet under his authority. Children were taught his catechism in every schoolroom of the Imperium. Old men died believing his face, when they were permitted to see it, was the face of a god who had sacrificed his humanity for their sake. But peace of this kind, peace enforced by a single unblinking eye that never closed and never forgot, was not the true purpose of Leto's reign, and he knew this better than any historian who would later try to explain him. He called what he was building the Golden Path, and he had described it once, in the private records he kept for a future he would never see, as a lesson written in bone and hunger and centuries of stagnation, a lesson humanity would carry in its very cells long after his name had become a myth too old to frighten anyone. The lesson was this: a people who submit entirely to one voice, one master, one comforting tyranny, will forget how to save themselves, and a people who forget how to save themselves will eventually die when no tyrant is left to protect them. So Leto gave his empire everything it could ask for except freedom, and, in the giving, he made freedom into the most precious and most forgotten thing in the universe, so that when it was finally restored to them, no descendant of his subjects would ever again hand it away so easily. To keep the great work moving forward, Leto maintained, with the patience of stone, the ancient breeding program that the Bene Gesserit had once guided, and that he had seized entirely for himself the moment he ascended to godhood. He tracked bloodlines the way a gardener tracks the growth of orchards planted centuries before his own birth, pairing this family with that one, exiling some lines to distant worlds, drawing others close to the temple at On, all of it aimed at a destination only he could see clearly, a destination involving prescience itself, and the terrible blindness that absolute prescience creates. He needed, above all, to breed a human being invisible to prescient sight, a person whose future no oracle, not even Leto himself, could read in advance, because such invisibility would one day be the only shield against the very future he was trying to prevent. A future in which humanity, having learned to be found by any power with eyes to see forward in time, could be hunted to extinction. And it was through this same long, patient program that a young woman named Siona Atreides was born into his direct line. A descendant of his father's house, and, though she did not yet understand it, the culmination of thousands of years of careful design. Siona grew up despising him. She had watched the machinery of the Empire close around ordinary lives, had watched her own father disappear into the unglamorous work of descent, and she had come, as many young Atreides had come before her, to see in the coiled length of the God Emperor not a divine protector, but a monster, wearing her family's name like a stolen coat. She joined a rebellion, one of the small, quiet rebellions that rose and were crushed with a regularity that had become almost ceremonial, and she was captured, as Leto had always intended she would be captured, because he had been waiting for her specifically, waiting across centuries of careful breeding for the arrival of exactly this temperament, this fury, this unbendable resistance to his will. He tested her in the fire of the deep desert itself, sending her alone into the wilderness that had once made his own ancestors into Fremen. And when she emerged alive, scorched and half-starving, but unbroken, he understood that she carried within her the very quality he had spent 3,000 years trying to cultivate. She was invisible to his prescient sight. He could not see her future. For the first time since the beginning of his rule, something existed inside his empire that even a god could not predict. At his side through all of this endured Duncan Idaho, though it was never truly the same man twice, for Leto kept a long unbroken succession of Golas grown from the original cells of the loyal swordmaster, who had died protecting Leto's grandfather Paul so many centuries before. Each new Duncan was awakened, given his memories in careful measure, and set to serve at the God Emperor's side as companion, conscience, and occasionally as the only voice in the entire Imperium willing to tell Leto plainly that what he had become was a horror. And each Duncan, in turn, fell in love with Siona, or with women like her. And each Duncan eventually died, sometimes by violence, sometimes by the simple exhaustion of living too long in a world too strange for a soldier's simple loyalties, and a new Duncan would be grown from the cell stock kept in the vaults beneath the citadel, brought forward again into a present he did not recognize, given the same memories, asked to fall in love with the same doomed devotion. The Duncan who lived in these last years of the tyranny watched Siona with the same careful, aching tenderness his predecessors had always felt, and he began, slowly, to understand what Leto had been building toward for all these centuries, though the shape of it still eluded him. Leto himself, in the privacy of his own endless awareness, felt the golden path drawing close to its hinge point, the moment when the entire weight of his sacrifice would finally turn toward its purpose. He had grown so heavy with worm flesh that scarcely anything human remained visible in him, only the small vestigial arms, the face still recognizable if one looked closely enough, buried in folds of segmented armor that could crush stone. He had outlived every companion he had ever loved. He had outlived every enemy who had ever tried to end him. And now, in the quiet of his own eternal patience, he began to prepare the final act of a plan that had taken 35 centuries to ripen, an act that would require his own death, chosen and orchestrated with the same exacting care he had given to every other decision of his impossibly long reign. Up next in Chapter 14, The Death of the God Emperor, we will follow Siona and Duncan as they move at last against the tyrant, and we will watch Leto walk, with strange and terrible peace, toward the bridge above the river, where his transformed body will finally return to the desert that made him, scattering the seeds of a new age of sandworms across the dying planet he loved more than his own. Flesh. There comes a moment in every long story of watching and waiting when the one who has done all the waiting finally decides that the waiting itself must end. And for Leto II, God Emperor of the known universe, that moment arrived not as a surprise, but as the quiet fulfillment of a plan he had carried inside himself since before Siona Atreides had even been born. He had spent 35 centuries steering his empire toward a single narrow gate in time, a gate through which humanity could pass only if he, the last and greatest of the worm gods, agreed to stop existing. He understood this with the calm clarity of someone who has rehearsed his own ending so many times in imagination that the reality holds no more terror than the falling of evening after a long, warm day. He would not simply die. He would arrange his death the way he had arranged everything else in his impossibly extended life, with total control, so that the manner of his ending would itself become the final and most important lesson of his entire reign. He gave Siona the last piece of what she needed to see clearly, allowing her at last to read the secret journals he had kept hidden across the centuries, the spice memories and confessions that explained, more honestly than he had ever explained anything to a living soul, exactly what the Golden Path had cost him, and exactly what it had been meant to purchase. She read of his loneliness, his grief for the humanity he had loved and disfigured himself to save, his terror of the vision he had glimpsed so long ago of a future in which some devouring enemy could hunt every last human being to extinction using the very gift of prescience that his own family had unleashed upon the universe. She understood, reading those pages, that Leto had not been a monster indulging endless vanity, but a man, or what remained of a man, who had accepted 3,500 years of solitary imprisonment inside a changing, worsening body so that his descendants might one day walk free of every tyranny, including his own. Something in Siona softened toward him then, not into love exactly, but into a grudging, sorrowful respect. And it was this softening that let her stand beside him rather than against him in the last days. Duncan, Idaho, the newest in the long line of Golas grown from that same loyal cellular seed across the centuries, could not soften so easily. He had spent his renewed life watching the corridors of the Citadel and the Fish-Speaker legions, and the whole grinding machinery of Leto's rule, and something in his soldier's heart, the same heart that had once died defending House Atreides on the sands of old Arrakis, rebelled against the sight of his friend and master trapped inside a body that was no longer recognizably human. He loved Siona, as every Duncan before him had loved a woman like her, and it was that love, tangled together with his old loyalty and his newer horror, that carried him forward on the day Leto had chosen for the end. Leto moved his great segmented bulk, slow and deliberate as a glacier, out onto the royal road that ran from the Citadel toward the river that fed the last green places of his capital, the artificial river he had commanded into being across a planet he had otherwise returned to bone-dry sand. He knew the bridge waited ahead of him, the bridge his engineers had built across the water at his own quiet instruction, built to a specification only he fully understood. A bridge that could be made to fail at precisely the right moment, beneath precisely the right weight. He had timed everything, down to the particular combination of decayed vulnerability in his own segmented hide. Thin patches, where too much water contact would at last undo the delicate armor that had protected him against the desert's dryness for so many centuries. Water was death to the sandtrout skin he wore. Water was the one thing his transformed body could never again safely embrace. And he had known this from the very first day he wrapped himself in that living cloak beside his sister. In the deep desert of his youth, he was walking, quite deliberately, toward the one force in the universe capable of finally killing a god who could not otherwise be killed. Siona and Duncan followed him onto the bridge, and there, in that suspended place between the citadel behind and the wilderness ahead, Leto let the last of his control give way. The stones beneath his impossible weight, weakened exactly as he had arranged them to be weakened, gave a long groan and then broke entirely. And Leto's vast segmented length went down into the river below in a slow, thunderous collapse that sent water surging outward in rings, as though the planet itself were exhaling. The water found him immediately, flooding into every crack the centuries had opened in his sandtrout armor, and Leto did not fight it. He had waited 3,500 years for this single moment of surrender, and now that it had come, he received it the way the desert receives the rare mercy of rain. Without struggle, only a vast and ancient relief spreading through whatever remained of the human consciousness, folded deep inside the worm's enormous unraveling body. What happened next was not death in any ordinary sense, and every scholar who studied it afterward understood that Leto had planned this too, had planned it as carefully as he had planned his own destruction. His body did not simply perish and rot away into nothing. It came apart in the water, segment by segment, and from those dissolving segments emerged, tumbling free into the river. Thousands upon thousands of small sand trout, the same tiny creatures that had once carried his own transformation, now scattering outward into the water to begin their ancient work again, sealing away moisture, waiting to grow, waiting to become, in the fullness of time, new sandworms that would rise from the riverbed's sand and begin the whole long cycle of the desert once more. Leto had died so that Arrakis, the dry and terrible planet his family had shaped and been shaped by across so many generations, might be reborn, might once again grow its worms and its spice and its fremen and its prophecies, all of it beginning again from the scattered seed of his own ended body. Before he sank fully beneath the water, in the last moments while some fragment of his old human mind still clung to awareness inside the dissolving flesh, Leto spoke to Duncan and to Siona both, telling them, in words too quiet for history to fully preserve, that the golden path was now secured, that his purpose was fulfilled, that the terrible gift of his long imprisonment was complete and irreversible, woven forever into the memory of every cell his descendants carried forward. He told them that humanity was free now to scatter, to run, to hide itself across the whole of space so widely and so unpredictably that no single power, however vast, however patient, could ever again gather every human life into one net and pull it closed. He told them this, and then the water closed over the last segment of his ancient body, and the god emperor of Dune, who had ruled the universe for 35 centuries and had given up his humanity twice over to save a species that mostly hated him for the gift, was gone. In the years that followed his death, Humanity did exactly what he had shaped it, across so much suffering, to do. Ships filled with settlers, dissidents, adventurers, and the simply restless poured outward from the crowded worlds of the old Imperium, vanishing into the vast unmapped dark beyond any border a chart could hold, beginning what history would come to call the scattering, a dispersal so wide and so thorough that even Leto's own extraordinary memory, folded now into the genetic inheritance of every human being who carried Atreides' blood, could no longer trace where all his children had gone. Up next in Chapter 15, The Scattering and the Long Silence, we will travel 1,500 years forward to Arrakis grown quiet and sand blown once more, where new worms crawl beneath old dunes and a wild girl named Shiana learns to call them to her side as if she had always known how. 1,500 years is a long time even for a story that measures itself in millennia, and by the time the universe had settled enough to be understood again in any single telling, almost everything Leto II had known in his long and terrible reign had passed into legend, half remembered, half invented, the way all distant history eventually becomes a soft blur of names and miracles. The empire he had ruled with such total and patient control had long since dissolved into something far stranger and far less governable, a vast, loose scattering of human civilization spread across more space than any single mind could hold in memory. A diaspora that history would simply call the scattering, and which had swallowed uncounted generations of wanderers into its silence. Whole populations had vanished beyond the reach of any remaining record, sailing outward on ships guided by guild navigators, or, in later years, by folded space techniques so refined and so widely dispersed that no central power could any longer track where humanity's countless branches had taken root. Some had found new worlds and built new civilizations utterly unlike anything the old Imperium would have recognized. Some had vanished into circumstances no one left behind could ever learn. And in all of that vast dispersal, small pockets of the old universe remained, still turning through their days in the shadow of memory, still keeping alive fragments of what had once been. Arrakis, as the planet Arrakis had come to be called in the centuries after Leto's transformation, had become desert again, fully and completely, exactly as he had intended in the last patient calculations of his impossibly long life. The green places he had commanded into being during his reign, the artificial river, and the small forests he had grown as monuments to his own contradictions, had withered away once his enormous will no longer held the ecology of the planet in careful balance, and the dunes had crept back across everything, burying the old glory and the old horror alike beneath the same forgetful sand that had first shaped the Fremen so long before. And from the seed of his own scattered body, the small trout creatures that had spilled into the river on the day of his death had done exactly what he foresaw, growing across the centuries into worms once more, vast and terrible and magnificent, rising from beneath the dunes to reclaim the planet as their own. So that Arrakis rang once again with the deep drumming thunder of the makers moving beneath the surface. And the spice, precious beyond every other substance in the universe, began once more to flow up from the depths in its old abundance. The people who lived upon Arrakis in these centuries were not quite Fremen in the old sense, though they carried within them the deep echoes of that ancient desert culture, a folk memory of prophecy and worm worship passed down through so many generations that the details had blurred into something closer to religion than history. They watched for signs. They told stories of the great God who had once walked among them in the shape of a worm, and they waited, in the patient way of desert people everywhere, for some new revelation to explain the meaning of their long and difficult lives. It was among these desert-dwelling people that a child appeared who would come to matter enormously to everything that followed. A girl named Shiana, born wild and fearless in the deep sand. A child who discovered, almost by accident, that she possessed some inherited resonance with the great worms themselves. Some deep genetic memory passed down from the ancient bloodlines of Muad'Dib and his descendants that allowed her to summon a worm and command it as no living person had done since the Fremen riders of the old empire. She would stand upon the open dunes, small and utterly unafraid, and call, and the sand would begin to tremble, and a maker would rise from beneath the desert floor to answer her, obedient in a way the worms answered no one else alive. Word of this child spread across Arrakis with the speed that only true wonder can travel, and soon it reached the ears of the priesthood that still ruled the planet in Leto's long absence, a religious order calling itself the Divided Gods Church, which still preserved, however imperfectly, the old rituals of worship that Leto had established for himself so many centuries before. They took Shiana into their care, half in reverence and half in calculation, understanding that a girl who could summon the Makers was either the most dangerous heretic their faith had ever produced, or the clearest sign yet that the divided God had not entirely abandoned his people. Word of Shiana traveled further still, carried outward by guild ships and by the quiet, patient network of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, which had endured across all 1,500 years of the scattering with the same unbroken continuity it had maintained since the earliest days of the old Imperium. The sisterhood, older than empires, older than the Atreides name itself, had watched the rise and fall of the Golden Path with the long patience of an order that measured its plans in centuries rather than lifetimes. And it understood immediately that a girl who could command the worms of Arrakis represented something of enormous consequence, a living thread connecting the present moment back to the deepest roots of the desert's power. They sent one of their own most capable reverend mothers, a woman named Odrade, to study the girl and, if possible, to bring her within the sisterhood's careful and watchful embrace. And in the same turning of years, deep within the vaults where the technology of Gola resurrection had never entirely been abandoned, a new Duncan Idaho was grown once again, brought forward out of the ancient cell line that had followed the Atreides family across every age of their long and complicated history, awakened once more into a universe he did not recognize, given a portion of his old memories, and set loose into a present that had moved 1,500 years beyond anything his previous incarnation had ever known. He arrived confused, disoriented, carrying within him fragments of loyalty to a family whose name still meant something on Arrakis and among the Bene Gesserit, though the empire that family had once ruled no longer existed in any recognizable form. He would come, in time, to matter enormously to what followed, drawn as every Duncan before him had been drawn, toward the gravity of great events he did not choose, but could never quite escape. The sisterhood, watching all of this unfold with the patient calculation of an order that had survived every catastrophe the universe could offer, understood that something was gathering just beyond the edge of their sight, some force moving inward from the vast, unmapped dark of the scattering. Some echo returning at last from all those centuries of human dispersal. They did not yet know its shape. They only knew, in the deep instinctive way that centuries of training had given them, that the long silence of the scattering was ending, and that whatever was coming back would not be gentle. Up next in Chapter 16, The Return of the Honored Maters, We will watch that silence break at last, as a fierce and merciless sisterhood born somewhere in the depths of the scattering comes sweeping back into known space, burning worlds behind them, hungry for dominance, and setting their eyes at last upon the desert planet of Arrakis and its worms. Out of the vast dark reaches where humanity had scattered so widely across 1,500 years of quiet dispersal, something came back at last, and it came without gentleness, without patience, without any of the slow diplomatic caution that had characterized so much of the ancient Imperium's dealings with itself. The Bene Gesserit had long sensed that some answer to the scattering would eventually return, some echo of all those uncounted ships and settlers who had vanished outward beyond the reach of every known chart. And now the echo arrived, and it called itself the Honored Matres. They were a sisterhood, though everyone who first encountered them understood quickly that the word sisterhood meant something entirely different in their mouths than it meant among the Bene Gesserit. Where the sisterhood of old had built its power through centuries of patient breeding programs, subtle political influence, and the quiet accumulation of knowledge, the Honored Matres had built theirs through a different and far more direct instrument, a trained and terrible sexual dominance that could bind men to them with a completeness that stripped away independent will entirely, leaving behind servants who called their bondage devotion and could no longer imagine wanting otherwise. The Honored Matres had learned this art somewhere in the deep unknown of the scattering, refined across the same long centuries that had refined the Bene Gesserit's own more measured disciplines, and where the old sisterhood sought balance and careful stewardship of humanity's long-term survival, the Honored Matres sought only conquest, only the swift and total subjugation of whatever world lay in their path. They swept back into known space with a fleet vast enough and violent enough that no remaining power in the old Imperium's fractured remnants could meaningfully resist them, and world after world that had spent 1,500 years rebuilding its own small version of civilization in the quiet aftermath of Leto's long peace fell before them in swift, merciless campaigns. Planets that had never seen war in living memory watched their skies fill with strange ships, watched their governments dissolve within days, watched their populations absorbed into whatever brutal new order the Honored Matres chose to impose. There was no negotiation to be had with them, no diplomacy that slowed their advance, only a hunger for domination so total that entire cultures were extinguished in the span of a single season, their histories erased, their people set to serve. And it was toward Arrakis, the desert planet that history remembered as the birthplace of the god who had once ruled the universe in the shape of a worm, that the Honored Matres eventually turned their full and terrible attention. They had learned, somewhere in their long campaign of conquest and absorption, of the planet's significance, of its worms and its spice and its strange, half-remembered religion of the divided god, and rather than seeking to control or exploit these things, as the old Imperium's melange hungry nobility might once have done, the Honored Matres chose instead the simpler and more devastating solution of destruction. Their ships came down upon Arrakis in an assault meant not to conquer, but to erase, and the deep desert that had shaped Fremen and Atreides and God Emperor alike burned beneath weapons designed to leave nothing living in their wake. The great worms, the makers who had returned across 15 centuries to reclaim the planet as their own inheritance from Leto's scattered body, died in the deep sand in numbers too vast to count. Their long dominion over Arrakis ended in a single season of fire. The planet itself, the birthplace of the spice that had once bound the entire human universe together in dependence and hunger, was rendered a wasteland even more thorough and more final than the desert it had always been. Its unique ecology extinguished, its worms slaughtered, its long, strange, sacred history reduced to ash and buried sand. Shiana, the girl who had learned to summon the Makers with nothing more than her own voice and her ancient inherited blood, escaped the destruction of her home world through the careful intervention of the Bene Gesserit, who had already drawn her into their protection before the honored Matress arrived, understanding with their long-trained foresight that the girl represented something far too precious to lose. She carried with her, in her memory and in her blood, the last living connection to the worms of Arrakis. A connection the sisterhood now understood might be the only thread capable of restoring, somewhere else, some new version of what had been destroyed. The Duncan Idaho Gola, too, found himself drawn into the sisterhood's protection during these terrible days, his loyalty and his confusion both deepening as he watched a universe he barely understood convulse under the weight of an enemy more savage than anything his own memories of the old Imperium had prepared him to expect. The Bene Gesserit, watching the destruction of Arrakis and the relentless advance of the honored Matras across world after world, understood at last that the long, slow patience which had guided their order for so many thousands of years would not be sufficient against an enemy of this kind. The honored Matras did not negotiate. They did not respect the old rules of influence and subtle manipulation that the sisterhood had always relied upon. They understood only strength, only conquest, only the swift application of dominance against any who resisted them, and so the Bene Gesserit, an order that had survived empires and gods and the entire long turning of history since the days before Paul Atreides first walked the sands of old Arrakis, found itself forced into open and desperate war, gathering its scattered strength, drawing its reverend mothers and its Gola and its precious few remaining resources into a single defensive struggle against an enemy that seemed, in those first terrible seasons, unstoppable. It was Odrade, the same reverend mother who had gone to study Shiana upon the deserts of Arrakis, who now found herself at the very center of the sisterhood's desperate response, tasked with holding together an order suddenly forced to fight for its own survival after so many centuries of quiet, patient influence from the shadows. She understood, better than almost anyone else within the sisterhood, that the war now beginning would not be won through the old methods, that something new would have to be learned, some new strength discovered, if the Bene Gesserit hoped to survive an enemy that had already erased the birthplace of the spice itself from the map of the living universe. And somewhere in the deep, dark places of her own long training, she began to sense that the answer might lie not in resisting the honored Matras directly, but in becoming, in some careful and terrible way, strong enough to meet them on their own violent terms, without losing the deeper wisdom the sisterhood had spent so many thousands of years accumulating. Up next, in Chapter 17, The Sisterhood's Last Stand, we will follow the Bene Gesserit as they gather their remaining strength upon their final refuge, preparing to meet the full weight of the honored Matras in a struggle that will decide whether anything of the old patient wisdom survives into whatever age comes next. 15 centuries and more had passed since the death of the God Emperor, and still the desert kept its patient watch over Arrakis, though the story had long since carried itself far from that single world, out across a galaxy grown wide and strange with the scattering of humankind. On a green planet called Chapter House, far from the golden dunes where the great sandworms once ruled alone, the Bene Gesserit had built a new home in secrecy. And it was here that the last quiet stand of the sisterhood would be made, though no one watching the soft rains fall over the rolling hills of that world could have guessed how close the end of all things truly stood. The Mother Superior of the Bene Gesserit in these late days was a woman named Darwi Odrade, and she carried her authority the way an old and heavy stone carries the weight of centuries, without complaint, without visible strain. Though the strain was there beneath the calm surface of her face for anyone who knew how to look. Odrade had risen through the long chain of reverend mothers who governed the sisterhood, and she had inherited not only the throne of leadership, but also the terrible burden of a truth the sisterhood dared not speak aloud too often, which was that they were being hunted, slowly and patiently, by something vast and cold that moved behind the veil of ordinary events, and that the immediate danger wearing the mask of pursuit was a fierce and violent order of women called the Honored Maters. The Honored Maters had come pouring back from the scattering, like a storm returning from the edge of the world, and wherever their ships descended, they left behind burned cities and broken governments, for their way was conquest through terror, and through a particular art of sexual domination they had refined into something almost supernatural in its power over men. They did not build as the Bene Gesserit built. They did not cultivate patience across generations, or breed carefully towards some distant purpose, or read the long threads of history as the sisterhood had always done. They took what they wanted swiftly and moved on, leaving devastation behind them like a wake behind a ship. And the whole of the old Imperium trembled at the mention of their coming, for there seemed no way to stop them, and no way even to fully understand where their fury had been born. Odrade understood, as the wisest of the reverend mothers before her had begun to understand, that the Honored Matres themselves were not the deepest danger. They were, in some way, that troubled even the calmest sisters late into the quiet hours of the night, running from something. Something had frightened the Honored Matres badly enough to send them fleeing back across the vast, dark distances they had once crossed outward in triumph, and whatever pursued them had never yet shown its true face to any eye, Bene Gesserit or otherwise, though its presence could be felt the way a great weight can be felt through a floor. A heaviness in the fabric of events that suggested an intelligence patient beyond imagining, hidden behind the noise and violence of the Honored Maters, like a hand hidden behind a puppet. Rather than meet the Honored Maters with the crude language of war, which the sisterhood could never hope to win through simple force of arms, Odrade set her mind toward an older and stranger strategy, one that had grown slowly out of centuries of Bene Gesserit patience. And it was this, that the two orders of women, so different on their surface, and yet so alike in the deep structure of what they had both once been taught, might be woven together into a single new order, absorbing what was fierce and useful in the Honored Matres, while tempering it with the wisdom and long sight of the Bene Gesserit way. It was a strategy of merging rather than defeating, of drawing the enemy inward and changing her from within rather than striking her down from without, and it was a strategy that asked for a courage different from the courage of soldiers, a courage of opening the gates rather than closing them. At the heart of this delicate and dangerous plan stood a woman named Murbella, who had once been counted among the Honored Matres themselves before circumstance and capture brought her into contact with the sisterhood, and who now stood as a living bridge between the two worlds, carrying in her own body and mind the terrible power of Honored Matre training, joined uneasily with the discipline and inner sight of Bene Gesserit teaching. Murbella was not a simple prisoner, nor a simple convert, but something new entirely. A woman poured from two different molds who had somehow to become a single vessel, and Odrade watched her with the careful attention of a gardener watching a graft take hold upon an old and weathered trunk, hoping that what grew from the joining would be stronger than either branch alone. The nights on Chapter House were long and gentle in those days, despite the danger pressing at the edges of the known worlds, and in the quiet hours the Reverend Mothers would gather in low candlelight to speak in soft voices of what must be done, weighing every possible future the way a careful hand weighs grain before the harvest, testing for weakness, testing for hidden rot. Odrade often walked alone in the evenings along the border, where the cultivated green of Chapter House gave way to a project few outside the innermost circles knew about, a great slow transformation of a portion of the planet into desert, sand laid down handful by handful across years, so that one day, if all else failed, the sisterhood might have a world of their own capable of bearing sandworms and spice, a desert planet to replace the one that memory alone could no longer sustain them with. It was in these quiet walks that Odrade felt most keenly the weight of what lay ahead, for she understood, in the deep, patient way the sisterhood had always understood such things, that the honored Matras were only the visible edge of a darkness that had not yet chosen to show itself fully, and that whatever hid behind them, whatever had frightened them into their long flight home, might in time turn its full attention toward Chapter House itself, and toward the green hills and the low candlelight and the slow, careful work of weaving two sisterhoods into one. She did not know its name. She did not know its shape. But she knew that a Mother Superior did not have the luxury of waiting for such knowledge to arrive on its own, and so, in the soft dark of those long nights, the last great stand of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood began to take its careful, patient shape. A stand made not of armies, but of strategy, not of walls, but of transformation. The oldest weapon the sisterhood had ever known turned now toward the strangest and most uncertain enemy they had ever faced. Up next, in Chapter 18, Chapter House and the Hidden War, we will follow the slow transformation of that green planet into desert so that the sandworms might rise again, and we will meet Shiana, who speaks with worms as Muad'Dib once did, and Duncan Idaho reborn once more as a Gola alongside the memory of Miles Tegg, all of them drawn together as the fusion of the two sisterhoods deepens and the unknown enemy draws closer through the dark between the stars. Deep beneath the green hills of Chapter House, in caverns and sealed chambers where no rain ever fell and no ordinary eye ever wandered, the Bene Gesserit carried forward a labor so patient and so vast that it could only be compared to the slow turning of the seasons themselves. And this labor was the making of a desert where none had been before, sand carried and laid and shaped across years until at last a portion of that gentle green world began to resemble, in its dry folds and rising dunes, the ancient face of Arrakis long lost to memory and to the terrible transformations of the God Emperor's age. It was a strange kind of hope to build a desert, yet the sisterhood understood, as they had always understood the deep threads of history, that a desert was not an absence, but a presence, a cradle in which the sand trout might curl and wait, in which small worms might one day grow large, in which the spice itself might someday rise again from the small blind creatures now being nurtured with such. Careful hands in the dark. Shiana walked among these early dunes the way a mother walks among sleeping children, for she alone among all the souls on Chapter House carried within her a strange and ancient gift, the power to call the great worms and be answered. A gift first given to a small girl long ago on Arrakis, who had ridden a worm through the open desert as though the enormous creature were no more than an obedient friend. That old gift had never left her, and now, grown into a woman trusted by the highest circles of the sisterhood, she brought her quiet authority to the new desert of Chapter House, walking its dunes barefoot in the cool hours before dawn, feeling for the faint tremor beneath the sand that told her the small worms were stirring, listening for the deep rhythm of a world remembering itself. Beside her, in those long, patient years, walked Duncan Idaho, though to call him simply Duncan Idaho was to miss the strange and layered truth of what he had become. For he had been born and reborn across the centuries as a Ghola more times than any single mind could easily hold, each awakening bringing back to him some new fragment of all the lives he had lived before. Soldier, to a duke, sword master, to an emperor, lover and confidant across ages that stretched back to the very fall of House Atreides. In this latest awakening, he carried within him not only his own long memory, but also, folded somewhere deep in the strange Gholas the sisterhood had learned to grow, the memory of Miles Tegg, the old and brilliant Bashar who had once given everything of himself to protect the sisterhood, and whose mind now lived again in a new body grown from careful cells. So that on Chapter House in those days, one might see two great heroes of ages long past walking together through the green hills and the rising dunes. Neither of them quite the men they had once been. Both of them somehow still exactly themselves. The fusion of the two sisterhoods that Odrade had set in motion continued in these years with the slow inevitability of tide. Honored Matres and Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers, learning to share not only strategy, but the deepest secrets of their respective disciplines. The raw sexual power the honored Matres had refined joining uneasily, but undeniably, with the ancient voice and inner awareness the sisterhood had cultivated across 10,000 years, and Murbella stood always at the center of this joining. A living proof that the melding could be done, even as she bore within her the strain of carrying two entire traditions inside a single body and a single will. There were nights when the strain showed plainly on her face, when the old fierce hunger of the honored Matri training rose up against the patient discipline the sisterhood demanded, and it took all of Odrade's careful guidance, all of the quiet support of the other Reverend Mothers, to hold that fusion steady, the way a hand holds a trembling flame steady against the wind. And all the while, behind every careful step, behind every quiet counsel held in low candlelight, there moved the shadow of the hidden war, for the enemy that had driven the honored Matres fleeing back from the far edges of the scattering had never revealed itself. And yet its presence pressed upon the sisterhood the way a coming storm presses upon the air, long before the first drop of rain falls. Ships appeared at the edges of known space and vanished before they could be questioned. Whole worlds within the old scattering fell suddenly silent, their communications ceasing as though some vast hand had simply closed over them. The sisterhood gathered what fragments of information they could, piecing together a portrait of an enemy that seemed to erase rather than conquer, that left behind no ruins and no survivors to tell what had happened, only silence where a world had been. It was this silence, more than any army or any weapon, that frightened the Reverend Mothers most deeply, for the sisterhood had faced tyrants before, had faced emperors and jihads and the terrible golden transformation of Leto II, and always there had been something to read, some pattern in the violence that a patient mind could eventually understand. But this new enemy left no pattern, only absence, and Odrade came to believe, walking often at night along the border between the green hills and the new desert, that the thing hunting them from beyond the edge of the scattering was not merely stronger than the honored Matres, but different in kind. Something that had grown in the vast dark distances beyond the reach of any Bene Gesserit eye, shaped by forces and pressures no one on Chapter House could yet imagine. Shiana, for her part, found a strange comfort in the desert itself during these uncertain years, for the small worms stirring beneath the new sand seemed to her a kind of promise that the old rhythms of the universe, the ancient bond between worm and spice, and human hand could still be called back into being even after everything else had been shattered and remade. She would kneel sometimes at the edge of a dune in the cool blue hour before sunrise, pressing her palm flat against the warming sand, feeling for that faint answering tremor. And in those moments, the vast unknown threat pressing upon the sisterhood from beyond the stars seemed almost distant, almost small, set against the patient certainty of a world remembering how to grow its own great sleeping guardians once more. Duncan watched her in these quiet moments, with the layered gaze of a man who had lived many lives and loved across many of them. And though the fear of the hidden enemy never fully left him, he found in Shiana's patient work among the dunes a reminder of why the long labor of the sisterhood still mattered. Why building a desert grain by grain, waking small worms one careful season at a time, might yet prove stronger in the end than any fleet or any army. For it was the kind of strength that did not announce itself, that grew quietly beneath the notice of enemies who understood only violence and never patience. Up next in Chapter 19, The Refuge at the Edge of Everything, we will follow Duncan Idaho and Shiana as they flee Chapter House aboard a hidden no ship crewed by Golas from ages long past, sailing out beyond the reach of any map into the vast unknown darkness, and we will glimpse the strange and unsettling old couple named Daniel and Marty, whose true nature reaches back further than anyone in the story yet understands, in the last unfinished chapter Frank Herbert ever gave to his great and unfinished saga. There comes a moment in the longest of stories when the path ahead grows too uncertain even for those who have walked every winding turn that came before. And such a moment arrived at last for Duncan Idaho and for Shiana, when the hidden pressure of the unknown enemy grew so heavy upon Chapter House that the wisest course left to them was not to stand and face what could not yet be understood, but to slip away entirely, beyond the reach of maps, beyond the reach of any fleet or any watching eye, out into the vast dark distances where even the patient reach of the Bene Gesserit could no longer follow. The vessel that carried them away was called a no-ship, a craft built and shielded by arts the sisterhood had gathered across long centuries so that it could pass utterly unseen through the currents of space, invisible not only to ordinary sight, but to the strange and terrible prescient vision that had once let Paul Atreides and his son Leto glimpse the threads of the future stretched out before them like paths across a great desert. To sail in a no-ship was to step outside the long habit of foresight that had shaped the destiny of House Atreides across 15,000 years, to become, for the first time in all that long history, a blank space in the vision of anyone who might try to look ahead and find you there. Aboard this quiet vessel traveled a crew unlike any that had ever set out before, for many among them were Golas, men and women grown again from careful cells and given back their old memories piece by piece, so that the ship carried within its close corridors echoes of ages long past walking now toward an unknown future, rather than remembering a settled one. Duncan Idaho moved among them with the calm of a man who had done this kind of leaving before, across many lives and many endings, and though the weight of all he had lost and rebuilt across the centuries never left his shoulders entirely, there was in him also a kind of quiet readiness, the readiness of someone who understood that survival itself was sometimes the only victory a person could reasonably hope to hold. Shiana walked the corridors of the no-ship in these early days of the long flight, with the same patient attention she had once given to the small worms stirring beneath the dunes of Chapter House. For even here, sealed away from any desert, she carried within her the deep calm of someone who trusted the slow unfolding of things rather than demanding to see the end of the road before setting her first foot upon it. She spoke softly with the crew in the long, quiet hours of the ship's passage, offering what comfort she could to those Golas newly wakened into memory and uncertain still of exactly who they had become. And in this way, she carried forward, in her own gentle fashion, the very oldest work of the sisterhood, which was the patient tending of frightened and uncertain souls through times too vast and too strange for any of them to fully grasp alone. Somewhere in the depths of that long voyage, hidden among passengers and crew whose true natures were not always what they first appeared, there traveled an old couple known only as Daniel and Marty, and it was in the quiet, careful glances they exchanged, and in the strange stillness that seemed to gather around them, even in crowded rooms, that the deepest mystery of the entire voyage came to rest. They were not what they seemed. Long habit and old suspicion suggested to those who watched them closest that they were face dancers, the ancient shape-shifting servants once bred by the scattered remnants of an old and ruthless trading house, creatures who could wear any face and any voice, and yet even this explanation did not seem to hold the whole truth. For something in the patience of their manner, something in the way they seemed always to be waiting rather than acting, suggested a purpose and a power reaching back further and deeper than any single house or any single order of the known history. It was never made entirely clear, in all the long telling of this vast tale, exactly what Daniel and Marty truly were, nor what final design moved quietly behind their calm and watchful eyes. For the story itself, spanning as it did 15,000 years of empires risen and fallen, of prophets and tyrants and patient sisterhoods, of worms and spice and the long, slow breathing of an entire galaxy learning and unlearning its own history, came at last to a place where the threads simply continued onward into darkness, rather than gathering into any final, tidy knot. The man who had first dreamed this story into being, who had carried Paul Atreides across the burning sand and Leto II across 3,000 years of golden solitude, left this last chapter of his creation open, unfinished, a door left ajar rather than closed, so that Daniel and Marty remain to this day two quiet figures standing at the edge of everything. Their true purpose, known only to the silence that swallowed the story before it could be told in full. And yet there is a kind of peace even in this unfinished ending. A peace that settles gently over the mind the way night settles over a desert once the last colors of sunset have faded from the sky. For perhaps it is fitting that a story so vast, so full of prophecy and transformation, and the long patient turning of centuries, should end not with an answer, but with an open door. An invitation for the mind to wander a little further on its own, imagining where Duncan and Shiana and their strange companions might have sailed, imagining what waited for them beyond the edge of the map, imagining Daniel and Marty's quiet, watching eyes and the secret they carried forward into a darkness the story itself never fully entered. The No ship continued on its way through that vast, unmapped dark, carrying within its shielded hull the last living threads of a history that had begun so very long ago with a single desert planet and a single fallen house. And though no one aboard could say with certainty what lay ahead, there was, in the quiet corridors and the soft hum of the ship's systems, a kind of steady breathing calm, the same calm the desert itself had always taught to those patient enough to learn it, the calm of continuing onward without needing to see the final shape of the road. Up next in Chapter 20, The Desert That Reclaims All, we will let the long story rest at last, following the endless turning of sand and spice and worm back to its own beginning. as the vast tale of Dune settles gently into the eternal, patient cycle from which it first arose. And so the long story comes at last to its quiet resting place, not with a final battle or a final word, but with the same soft, patient image that stood at its very beginning, a wide desert stretching beneath a pale and endless sky, sand rolling gently from horizon to horizon in long, unhurried waves, as though the whole vast tale of empires and prophets and golden tyrants had only ever been a single long breath drawn by the desert itself, held for 15,000 years, and now, slowly, gently, released back into the stillness from which it first arose. Think for a moment of the spice, that rare and precious substance born from the deep and secret workings of the great sandworms, rising up through the sand in its own unhurried season, the way dew rises in the cool hours before dawn, carrying within its faint cinnamon scent the power to bend time itself, to let the mind reach forward and glimpse the long threads of the future, and to bind together. Across all those centuries, the fortunes of noble houses and desert tribes and ancient sisterhoods alike. The spice did not care for empires. It did not care for prophecies or wars or the golden transformation of a god-emperor's endless patience. It simply rose and fell and rose again, following its own slow rhythm beneath the sand. Indifferent to the brief and busy lives of the people who fought so fiercely to possess it. And think too of the great worms themselves, those vast and ancient guardians of the desert, moving beneath the dunes with a slowness that made mountains seem hurried by comparison. Each one born from the humble sand trout, each one destined across its own long life to become something magnificent and terrible and holy all at once. A living God beneath the sand, who asked nothing of the small creatures walking above except respect, and offered nothing in return except the spice and the water of life, and the deep, wordless wisdom of a creature who had watched empires rise and vanish the way a person might watch clouds pass overhead on some warm and drifting afternoon. It is worth remembering, now in this last quiet hour of the telling, how it all began, with a single desert planet called Arrakis, and a single noble house brought low by treachery, a duke betrayed, a mother and her son fleeing into the deep wilderness of sand, finding shelter among a fierce and patient desert people who had waited, in their own way, for longer than anyone could easily measure, for a prophecy to come walking out of the wilderness toward them. It is worth remembering the boy who became a prophet, and the prophet who became an emperor, and the terrible weight that settled upon his shoulders when he saw, with his own borrowed sight, how far the fire of his own legend might spread if left unchecked, how many worlds might burn in the name of a faith he had never truly meant to become a tyrant. It is worth remembering, too, his children, born already wise beyond any measure of ordinary childhood, carrying within them the terrible burden of every ancestor's memory pressed into a single small and struggling mind, and the daughter who was lost for a time to that pressing weight, and the son who chose, with open eyes and a courage almost too large for any single heart to hold, to walk a golden path across 3,000 years of solitude so that humankind might finally learn to scatter itself so widely across the stars that no single tyranny, no single vision, however golden, could ever again hold it all in one closed hand. And it is worth remembering the long, quiet centuries that followed his passing, the scattering of humanity out into distances too vast for any single sisterhood or empire to map, the return at last of fierce and frightened women fleeing something even they could not name, and the patient, careful work of an old order of women who chose, in the end, not to meet violence with violence, but to open their arms instead, weaving two very different traditions into something new and untested, hoping that patience, given enough time, might still outlast even the strangest and most hidden of enemies. And it is worth remembering, finally, the quiet ship sailing out beyond the edge of every known map, carrying forward the last living threads of this immense and unfinished story, drifting into a darkness whose true shape none of us will ever fully know. For some stories are simply too large to be closed up neatly, too large to be folded away with a final answer, and perhaps that, in the end, is only fitting for a story that began with a single desert and grew, across 15,000 years, into the whole wide unfolding of a galaxy. Let the mind rest now on that first image once more. The pale sky over Arrakis. The long, slow waves of sand rolling gently toward a horizon without any edge. The small, quiet sound of wind moving over dunes that have not changed in all the ages this story has traveled through. Somewhere beneath that sand, a small creature is curling itself into a deeper sleep, waiting for its own slow season to arrive. Somewhere above it, the wind is smoothing away the last few footprints of the day, the way it has always done, the way it will always do, patient and unhurried and endlessly, gently returning everything at last to stillness. And here, in this same soft stillness, let your own thoughts settle too, drifting loose from the long threads of empires and prophecies and golden paths, sinking slowly down into the quiet dark the way sand settles after the wind has passed. Nothing left to hold on to now but the slow, even rhythm of your own breathing, soft and steady, carrying you gently down into rest. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we crossed the whole of it, a desert planet called Arrakis, the fall of House Atreides, the flight into the deep desert, the Fremen and their prophecy, and the rise of Muad'Dib. We watched an emperor fall and a duke's son ascend, the 12 years of the jihad, the blind emperor walking into the sand, and the children who came after. We followed the possession of Aliyah, the beginning of the Golden Path, the God Emperor, and 3,000 years of his terrible peace, and the death that set humankind free. We saw the great scattering into the dark, the return of the honored maters, the sisterhood's last stand, the hidden war of Chapter House, a refuge at the edge of everything, and at the last, the desert that reclaims all things in its own slow time. There is nothing left now that you must carry. Let each of those vast and distant things sink away from you, down through still and silent sand, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here asks anything of you, and none of it can follow you into sleep. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like heat shimmer over an evening dune. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us and let a gentle subscribe keep them coming. There are many more long, slow tales waiting for the nights ahead.